U.S. Special Forces have spent decades fighting in the world's toughest conflicts, from Vietnam to El Salvador in the Middle East. These are 7 of their most significant operations. In the early months of 2003, as the United States prepared for the imminent invasion of Iraq, a covert operation was already in motion deep in the northern mountains of the country. Known as Operation Viking Hammer, this critical mission was designed to dismantle Ansar al-Islam, a radical Islamist group entrenched in the rugged region near Halabja. This mission was not only a tactical strike against terrorism, but a vital precursor to the full-scale coalition invasion that would soon follow. At the heart of Operation Viking Hammer were the elite operators of Task Force Viking, primarily drawn from the U.S. Army's 10th Special Forces Group Airborne, along with Kurdish Peshmerga fighters and other intelligence assets. These men operated under the umbrella of Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force North, charged with destabilizing enemy strongholds, securing strategic points, and sowing confusion among Saddam Hussein's regime in the lead-up to the main assault from the south. The mission had a dual objective: first, to eliminate Ansar al-Islam and its suspected chemical weapons capabilities; second, to create a northern front that would keep Iraqi forces divided, making the eventual invasion more effective. Ansar al-Islam, led at the time by Mullah Krekar and deeply influenced by foreign jihadist ideologies, had established a quasi-state in villages and mountainous terrain along the Iranian border. Their presence not only posed a direct threat to U.S. interests, but also to regional stability. What made Operation Viking Hammer unique was the complexity of coordinating U.S. Special Operations troops with Kurdish forces who had their own internal political dynamics, rivalries, and agendas. Special Ops 6 is now live. If you're into elite gear, field-ready morale patches, and real operator culture, this is for you. Tap the link in the description or head to the channel and click the store link. Join the team, grab your gear, and support the mission, and let's get back to it. The U.S. had to balance these factors while conducting clandestine insertions, establishing forward operating bases in enemy-controlled territory, and collecting intelligence on a highly secretive militant network. Infiltration began under cover of darkness in early March. Utilizing MH-47 Chinook helicopters flown by the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment SOAR, U.S. Green Berets inserted into the mountainous terrain with limited visibility and high risk of detection. Weather conditions were brutal, freezing temperatures, steep cliffs, and the constant threat of enemy ambush made every movement hazardous. Once on the ground, U.S. Special Forces linked up with units of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan (PUK), who had been fighting Ansar al-Islam for years. These Kurdish fighters provided invaluable intelligence and served as both guides and combat support. Initial reconnaissance missions confirmed fortified bunkers, sniper positions, and cave systems used by the enemy. The terrain favored defenders, and the enemy was well prepared. Despite this, the American-Kurdish coalition began shaping the battlefield. Airstrikes from U.S. fighter jets and drones began pounding identified targets, softening enemy positions. Small units of Green Berets conducted direct action raids on supply lines and communications nodes, disrupting Ansar's ability to coordinate defenses. PSYOPs teams broadcast messages to encourage enemy desertion and intimidate those who remained. The coalition's success relied heavily on speed, surprise, and coordination. Intelligence flowed in from multiple sources, including Kurdish informants, intercepted communications, and drone surveillance. Every successful strike built momentum, forcing the enemy to retreat further into the mountains. In one notable raid, U.S. operators uncovered evidence of foreign fighter involvement, including passports, training materials, and chemical precursors, bolstering the claim that Ansar al-Islam posed more than just a regional threat. Yet the battle was far from over. The rugged geography allowed fighters to regroup and mount fierce counterattacks. U.S. Special Forces found themselves in near-constant contact with the enemy, trading fire across valleys and ridgelines. Several operators were wounded, and some narrowly avoided death in ambushes and improvised explosive attacks. But morale remained high, and the mission pressed on. As March continued, the operation expanded. More troops were flown in, and the offensive against Ansar's stronghold at Sargat, believed to house a chemical weapons lab, became the focal point. This would be the final push. Operation Viking Hammer was not just a tactical operation, but a demonstration of unconventional warfare at its finest. It showcased how special forces, indigenous allies, and precision air power could combine to dismantle a hardened terrorist network in one of the most difficult environments imaginable. As the operation against Ansar al-Islam intensified in March 2003, the focus of Task Force Viking shifted to one primary objective: the village of Sargat. Nestled in the rugged mountains near the Iranian border, Sargat was believed to house Ansar al-Islam's main command center and, most alarmingly, a suspected chemical weapons facility. The final phase of Operation Viking Hammer would revolve around seizing this stronghold, a mission that would push U.S. Special Forces and Kurdish fighters to their limits. Sargat was no ordinary target. Satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and human intelligence all pointed to heavy enemy fortifications. Underground bunkers, fighting positions carved into cliffs, and cave networks gave Ansar's fighters a strong defensive advantage. The terrain offered natural choke points and limited access routes, meaning a frontal assault would be perilous and costly. Task Force Viking, composed of Green Berets from the 10th Special Forces Group and elements of Kurdish PUK forces, began a slow and deliberate advance toward Sargat. Fire support came in the form of U.S. air power, including AC-130 gunships and F-15s that conducted precision strikes against known enemy positions. Bombing runs softened resistance, but the defenders were dug in deep, and the worst of the fighting was still ahead. The assault began just before dawn. Under the cover of darkness and artillery fire, small U.S. Kurdish teams began infiltrating the outer edges of the village. The plan was to encircle the objective and collapse inward, clearing one sector at a time. It was methodical, dangerous work. The defenders, many of them foreign jihadists with experience in Afghanistan, fought fiercely with small arms, mortars, and machine guns. Heavy firefights erupted across multiple fronts. In one instance, a U.S. Special Forces team maneuvered through a dry riverbed to flank a bunker, only to come under intense fire from a ridgeline above. With limited cover and mounting casualties, they called in close air support. An F-16 dropped precision-guided munitions on the position, neutralizing the threat and allowing the team to advance. Another unit discovered a network of tunnels beneath a mosque in the village center. These tunnels were rigged with explosives and booby traps, and clearing them took hours of painstaking room-by-room work. It was here that operators uncovered training manuals, foreign passports, and chemical agents that provided proof of Ansar al-Islam's links to global terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. The fighting continued throughout the day. At one point, Kurdish Peshmerga fighters advanced too quickly and were caught in a counterattack. A quick reaction force of Green Berets rapidly deployed to support them, repelling the enemy with grenades, rifles, and coordinated fire from a circling AC-130. Despite the intensity of resistance, the coalition forces maintained momentum. The combination of ground assault, tactical surprise, and relentless air cover broke the defenders' cohesion. By nightfall, most of Sargat had been cleared. The remaining Ansar fighters fled into the mountains or were captured, and the village was secured. With Sargat under control, the focus turned to site exploitation. Chemical weapon precursors were documented, and forensic teams began cataloging evidence. Among the finds were mustard agent components, protective gear, and manuals detailing chemical dispersal techniques. These discoveries were significant, lending weight to pre-war intelligence that had suspected a WMD connection. In the aftermath of the battle, the scale of the operation's success became clear. Dozens of militants had been killed, dozens more captured, and a key terrorist hub had been dismantled. Perhaps more importantly, the capture of Sargat gave coalition forces a foothold in northern Iraq that would prove vital for subsequent operations. The Battle of Sargat also served as a powerful case study in joint unconventional warfare. The cooperation between American Special Forces and Kurdish fighters, supported by air power and intelligence, had achieved what conventional forces alone might not have. In a matter of days, a hardened enemy network was eliminated and strategic momentum shifted toward the coalition. Task Force Viking suffered casualties, but their mission was accomplished. Morale soared as teams returned to their forward operating bases to regroup and prepare for what came next. The fight was far from over. Saddam Hussein's regime still held power, and the full-scale invasion was only just beginning, but Operation Viking Hammer had struck an early and decisive blow. With Sargat secured and Ansar al-Islam dismantled, the operational success of Viking Hammer echoed well beyond the immediate battlefield. As the dust settled, intelligence officers and planners began to unravel the broader implications of what had just been achieved. The operation was not only a tactical victory, but a strategic triumph that would influence the unfolding Iraq War and reshape how U.S. Special Operations Forces conducted future missions. One of the most important outcomes was the intelligence haul. Forensic teams at Sargat documented vast caches of data, personnel records, training manuals, communications gear, and chemical weapon precursors. Among the items recovered were components used for mustard gas production, protective suits, dispersal instructions, and foreign identification papers from jihadists hailing from Yemen, Syria, and beyond. This provided concrete evidence linking Ansar al-Islam to transnational terrorist networks and potential WMD proliferation. For policymakers, it was a moment of vindication for some of the pre-war intelligence assessments. The swift and decisive nature of the operation also set a precedent for unconventional warfare. Operation Viking Hammer demonstrated the effectiveness of joint operations between elite U.S. Special Forces and indigenous allies, in this case, the Kurdish Peshmerga. The success validated the doctrine of using small, highly trained units to partner with local forces, gather intelligence, and conduct surgical strikes against high-value targets. This model would become a cornerstone of U.S. counterterrorism and counterinsurgency strategies in both Iraq and Afghanistan. For the Kurds, the operation strengthened political and military ties with the United States. Their role in capturing Sargat earned them newfound respect and operational legitimacy. In the months and years that followed, Kurdish forces became a critical ally in northern Iraq, contributing to stability and helping secure key terrain during the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime. Task Force Viking's success also had ripple effects across the wider U.S. Special Operations community. The integration of real-time intelligence, precision air power, and maneuvering special operations units proved highly effective. Lessons learned from Viking Hammer were quickly disseminated across SOCOM and influenced planning for subsequent raids and campaigns, including operations in Mosul, Fallujah, and the broader Anbar province. Additionally, the battle highlighted the importance of having the right support units in place. Air Force Special Tactics teams provided critical coordination for airstrikes, while Psychological Operations (PSYOP) team worked to influence local populations and minimize resistance. Civil affairs units laid groundwork for follow-up stability efforts, and logistics teams ensured that the remote operating bases could sustain combat operations in rugged conditions. Viking Hammer wasn't just a victory of shooters on the ground, but a demonstration of how joint and interagency cooperation could deliver strategic results. On a human level, the operation left a lasting mark on those who participated. Veterans of Task Force Viking recall the intensity of the fighting, the terrain's unforgiving nature, and the bonds forged in battle with their Kurdish counterparts. Many would go on to serve in further campaigns throughout Iraq and Afghanistan, taking with them the hard-earned experience of Sargat. In Washington and military circles, Operation Viking Hammer was used as a case study in congressional briefings and military education programs. It served as a template for future counterterrorism operations, emphasizing speed, precision, local partnerships, and adaptability. However, the operation also served as a reminder of the complexity of modern warfare. While the Sargat raid was successful, it underscored how insurgent networks could embed themselves in civilian populations and mountainous terrain, requiring nuanced and often dangerous operations to root them out. In the years that followed, Ansar al-Islam remnants attempted to regroup, but the loss of their stronghold severely hampered their capabilities. Coalition forces continued to track and eliminate remaining cells, but Sargat remained a symbol of their fall. For the Kurdish region, it marked a turning point in their autonomy and partnership with the U.S. military. Operation Viking Hammer tells the story of a mission whose impact extended far beyond the battlefield. It was a carefully executed strike that not only neutralized a dangerous enemy, but also reshaped the playbook for American special operations in the 21st century. The legacy of Viking Hammer is one of precision, partnership, and profound strategic consequence, a blueprint for how to fight and win against deeply entrenched terrorist threats. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment so you don't miss out. The CIA was first to enter Afghanistan. As early as September 26, 2001, Team Jawbreaker, a small group of CIA Special Activities Division SAD operatives and paramilitary officers, infiltrated the Panjshir Valley by helicopter. Their mission? was to establish early contact with Ahmad Shah Massoud's Northern Alliance and begin the process of target identification, intelligence gathering, and preparing the battle space. Tragically, Massoud himself had been assassinated just 2 days before the 9/11 attacks, but his forces remained ready and motivated. Soon after, U.S. Army Special Forces Operational Detachment Alpha's ODAs began to deploy from staging areas in Uzbekistan and other surrounding regions. These Green Berets, working in 12-man teams, carried everything with them: communications gear, medical supplies, and laser designators to call in airstrikes. One of the first teams, ODA 555, infiltrated into the Darya Suf Valley to link up with General Dostum's Northern Alliance faction. The American teams entered a world frozen in time. Horseback travel was common, terrain was unforgiving, and Taliban resistance was fierce. Yet the Green Berets adapted quickly. The now famous image of a Special Forces soldier riding horseback with Afghan allies became an iconic symbol of Task Force Dagger's operations. Task Force Dagger operated under the umbrella of U.S. Central Command, with Special Operations Command Central SOG playing a critical role. The overall commander was Major General Del Daly, who worked closely with the CIA and coalition partners. The structure was fluid but effective. CIA paramilitary teams worked alongside and ahead of military elements, bridging gaps in intelligence and diplomacy. Special Ops 6 is now live. If you're into elite gear, field-ready morale patches, and real operator culture, this is for you. Tap the link in the description or head to the channel and click the store link. Join the team, grab your gear, and support the mission, and let's get back to it. 5th Special Forces Group, ODAS, provided unconventional warfare expertise, leading local Northern Alliance forces into battle and directing air power. Air Force combat controllers and TACP teams embedded with ODAs were critical in coordinating close air support and precision strikes. U.S. Air Force and Navy provided the bulk of strike aircraft and logistical airlift. Civil affairs and psychological operations teams supported stabilization and messaging efforts. The early focus was to establish footholds with friendly Northern Alliance warlords across different parts of Afghanistan. In the north, teams worked with Dostum and Ata Mohammed Noor. In the east, others linked up with commanders like Hazrat Ali. Each area presented unique challenges, from terrain to tribal politics. Simultaneously, B-52 bombers and other aircraft began conducting strategic strikes on Taliban and al-Qaeda positions. These bombing campaigns were often called in directly by Special Forces teams on the ground, who had eyes on target and could provide real-time feedback. This horseback plus B-52 tactic became a defining method of early U.S. success. Life for these early teams was rugged, dangerous, and isolated. Communications were limited, medical evacuation was unreliable, and resupply often had to be improvised. Yet morale remained high. These elite units had trained for years for missions exactly like this. The blend of autonomy, strategic importance, and close coordination with indigenous forces gave them an unmatched sense of purpose. The bonds between U.S. teams and their Afghan counterparts deepened quickly. Green Berets ate, slept, and fought alongside Northern Alliance fighters, earning trust through shared risk and respect. Intelligence sharing improved, target acquisition became faster, and by late October, key Taliban-held cities were beginning to fall. The success of these early raids wasn't just tactical, it was symbolic. It demonstrated that America could strike back effectively without waiting to assemble a massive conventional army. It showed the power of SOF Special Operations Forces in modern warfare and how small, highly trained units with the right tools and local partnerships could dismantle larger enemy forces. This model of warfare would become a blueprint for future operations in Iraq, Syria, the Horn of Africa, and beyond. It emphasized agility over mass, precision over saturation, and partnerships over occupation. As October came to a close, Task Force Dagger had achieved what few thought possible. Taliban lines were breaking. Mazar-e-Sharif, a key city in the north, was nearing liberation, and most importantly, the Taliban were beginning to retreat toward their southern stronghold of Kandahar, but the fight was far from over. As Operation Enduring Freedom moved into full swing, the insertion of CIA operatives and U.S. Army Special Forces teams, particularly from the 5th Special Forces Group, had set the stage for one of the most rapid, unconventional campaigns in modern military history. In partnership with anti-Taliban factions, such as the Northern Alliance, U.S. Special Operations Forces began to coordinate airstrikes, gather intelligence, and initiate tactical offensives against key Taliban strongholds. A focal point for this campaign was the strategic city of Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan. The city held immense tactical value. It was home to one of the country's few usable airfields, served as a major logistical node, and was considered a symbolic gateway to further advances into Taliban-controlled territory. Controlling Mazar would enable coalition forces to open a land bridge for aid and arms and would severely undermine Taliban morale. ODA 595, led by Captain Mark Nutch and working with CIA officers such as David Tyson and Mike Spann, was embedded with General Abdul Rashid Dostum's forces. Their mission was to coordinate with local anti-Taliban commanders, help direct U.S. air power, and prepare for a decisive assault on Mazar-e-Sharif. This is where history was made. ODA 595, famously known as the Horse Soldiers, were inserted into Afghanistan in mid-October 2001. To operate in the steep mountainous terrain, the team adapted to their environment by riding horseback alongside Northern Alliance fighters. These Green Berets, trained in unconventional warfare, became symbols of adaptability and grit as they blended traditional combat skills with 21st century firepower. Armed with laser designators, satellite radios, and intimate local intelligence from CIA operatives, these operators directed devastating U.S. airstrikes on Taliban and al-Qaeda positions. Soviet-era tanks and technicals manned by Taliban fighters were reduced to rubble. Air supremacy, combined with on-the-ground coordination, shifted the tide quickly in the Northern Alliance's favor. The actual battle for Mazar-e-Sharif began in earnest in early November 2001. Dostum's fighters, bolstered by the close cooperation with U.S. forces, launched a multi-pronged assault on the city. The Taliban put up resistance, but faced with relentless bombing runs from B-52s, AC-130 gunships, and precision strikes coordinated by special forces and CIA teams, their lines began to crumble. On November 9th, Mazar-e-Sharif fell. The speed of the city's collapse shocked Taliban leadership and international observers. U.S. officials had expected a much longer, more drawn-out siege. Instead, the fusion of local insurgents, CIA operatives, and special forces operators had upended traditional timelines of war. The victory opened the gates for expanded operations into northern Afghanistan and catalyzed a domino effect that would soon reach cities like Kabul and Kandahar. While Mazar's fall was a triumph, it was also the prelude to one of the campaign's bloodiest incidents. In late November, a group of foreign fighters, primarily al-Qaeda, who had surrendered after the battle, were held at Kala-e-Jangi, a fortress on the outskirts of the city. Among the detainees was John Walker Lind, the infamous American Taliban. Unbeknownst to the Northern Alliance and CIA handlers, these prisoners had concealed weapons. On November 25th, they launched a surprise uprising within the fortress. Mike Spann, a CIA paramilitary officer from the Special Activities Division, was attempting to interrogate prisoners when the riot broke out. He was killed in the initial chaos, becoming the first American killed in combat in Afghanistan post 9/11. Over the next several days, a joint force of Special Forces, British SAS, AC-130s, and Dostum's fighters laid siege to the fortress. The uprising was brutally suppressed. Airstrikes and gunfire eventually quelled the insurgents. Of the roughly 400 prisoners, most were killed, though some were captured or recaptured. The incident was a harsh reminder of the operational risks and moral complexity of asymmetrical warfare. Following Mazar-e-Sharif, U.S. Special Forces and CIA teams deployed in increasing numbers throughout Afghanistan. The template established at Mazar, embedding with local forces, guiding airstrikes, and executing rapid maneuver warfare, was replicated across the country. Teams inserted into the Panjshir Valley worked with other Northern Alliance commanders to isolate and collapse Taliban strongholds near Kabul. Within weeks, the capital would fall. Elsewhere, CIA teams were working in Herat, Jalalabad, and even deep into Taliban territory near Kandahar, preparing for larger offensives. Central to this campaign's success was the dominance of U.S. air power. Strategic bombers dropped ordnance with pinpoint accuracy, while fast-moving jets provided close air support. More significantly, it was the presence of trained JTACs, Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, and combat controllers embedded with Special Forces and CIA teams that ensured every bomb counted. The combination of air power, unconventional tactics, and intelligence fusion created a multiplier effect that Taliban forces could not withstand. While the operators on horseback and in direct firefights drew headlines, much of the campaign's success hinged on the unseen work of support units. Combat controllers from the Air Force guided bombs onto targets. Tactical signal detachments ensured real-time satellite communication. Medical specialists operated forward surgical units near combat zones. Intelligence analysts at CIA stations and SOCOM's joint operations centers worked around the clock, ensuring accurate target selection and operational security. The 160th SOAR Special Operations Aviation Regiment played a pivotal role inserting teams via MH-47 and MH-60 helicopters, often in high-altitude, low-visibility environments. Their pilots executed some of the most daring insertions and extractions of the entire war. What unfolded in the early days of the Afghanistan invasion was a blueprint for future special operations campaigns. Rather than deploying thousands of troops in conventional formations, the U.S. had found that a small number of elite personnel, combined with air superiority and reliable local partners, could achieve rapid and decisive outcomes. The reliance on local warlords, the ambiguity of tribal alliances, and the fluid nature of battlefield loyalties meant that each win carried political and strategic risks. Still, in terms of military execution, the fall of Mazar-e-Sharif was a masterclass in irregular warfare and joint SOF-CIA cooperation. By late November 2001, the landscape of Afghanistan had been utterly transformed. The lightning-fast campaign led by CIA paramilitary teams, U.S. Army Special Forces primarily from the 5th Special Forces Group, and their Northern Alliance allies had resulted in the fall of key cities such as Mazar-e-Sharif, Herat, and even Kabul. But one final stronghold remained the spiritual and political heart of the Taliban regime, Kandahar. What unfolded in the early days of the Afghanistan invasion was a blueprint for future special operations campaigns. Rather than deploying thousands of troops in conventional formations, the U.S. had found that a small number of elite personnel, combined with air superiority and reliable local partners, could achieve rapid and decisive outcomes. But these victories came with complications. The reliance on local warlords, the ambiguity of tribal alliances, and the fluid nature of battlefield loyalties meant that each win carried political and strategic risks. Still, in terms of military execution, the fall of Mazar-e-Sharif was a masterclass in irregular warfare and joint SOF-CIA cooperation. By late November 2001, the landscape of Afghanistan had been utterly transformed. The lightning-fast campaign led by CIA paramilitary teams, U.S. Army Special Forces primarily from the 5th Special Forces Group, and their Northern Alliance allies had resulted in the fall of key cities such as Mazar-e-Sharif, Herat, and even Kabul. But one final stronghold remained the spiritual and political heart of the Taliban regime, Kandahar. Kandahar was no ordinary city. It was the birthplace of the Taliban movement, home to Mullah Omar's command network, and symbolic of Taliban dominance. The U.S. and its Afghan partners knew that capturing it would effectively mark the collapse of the Taliban's hold on power. To take Kandahar, U.S. Special Forces used the same successful model that had worked in the north: insert a small team, link up with local anti-Taliban groups, establish rapport, and begin the fusion of precision airstrikes with unconventional warfare. Operational Detachment Alpha ODA teams, such as ODA 574, were deployed into the area along with CIA Special Activities Division officers to help pave the way. The Allied partner in the south would not be the Northern Alliance, but instead, local Pashtun commanders, such as Gul Aga Shirzai and Hamid Karzai the latter, would later become Afghanistan's interim and then elected president. The cooperation between U.S. Special Forces and Karzai's fighters was a pivotal moment in the southern campaign. While the Taliban continued to hold out in Kandahar and its surrounding villages, morale among their fighters was beginning to crack. Reports of mass defections, collapsed supply lines, and devastating U.S. airstrikes were spreading. Nevertheless, resistance was fierce in certain pockets. ODA 574 inserted to support Karzai's advance. On December 4, 2001, tragedy struck. A misdirected U.S. JDAM Joint Direct Attack munition struck Karzai's position, killing several Afghan fighters and wounding 3 members of ODA 574, including team leader Captain Jason Amarine and the Air Force Combat Controller Jefferson Donald Donnie Cash, who later died from his wounds. The incident highlighted the ever-present danger of fratricide in joint operations, but also served as a rallying point for Afghan and American forces alike. Despite the loss, Karzai and the remaining U.S. personnel pressed forward. The combination of U.S. air power and Special Forces presence continued to break the Taliban's will to fight. By December 7, 2001, Kandahar had fallen. Mullah Omar and senior Taliban officials had fled. The regime had collapsed in a matter of weeks. The U.S.-led coalition, using fewer than 500 SOF and CIA operatives on the ground, had accomplished what many military planners thought would take months or even years. With Kandahar in Allied hands, the Taliban as a central governing force had effectively ceased to exist, though remnants and future insurgent networks would soon begin to reorganize in the shadows. The rapid fall of Taliban power was not due to a massive invasion or overwhelming ground forces, but because of precision, adaptability, and special operations excellence. In the weeks following Kandahar's fall, coalition forces began shifting toward stabilization efforts, prisoner handling, and securing remaining al-Qaeda hideouts. The campaign against al-Qaeda, however, was far from over. Tora Bora, deep in the White Mountains, would soon become a focal point in the attempt to capture Osama bin Laden. That would be a separate operation with its own complications. Still, the unconventional warfare doctrine showcased during the Kandahar campaign would serve as the model for many of America's future engagements. Rather than large force-on-force battles, the new American approach would rely on highly mobile, culturally aware, and surgically lethal teams that worked in sync with intelligence, air power, and local allies. Task Force Dagger, composed primarily of CIA Special Activities Division teams, Army Special Forces from the 5th Special Forces Group, and supporting Air Force Special Operations and JSOC elements, demonstrated that the future of warfare was changing. This small, agile task force had executed one of the most daring and efficient campaigns in U.S. military history. Their success hinged on several key elements: interagency coordination between CIA and DoD components, cultural fluency and trust building with Afghan factions, precision targeting enabled by combat controllers and laser-guided munitions, intelligence fusion often in real time. At the tactical level, extreme adaptability with Green Berets riding horses in mountainous terrain and living with indigenous forces for weeks at a time. The iconic image of Special Forces riding horseback with Afghan fighters became a symbol of American ingenuity and resolve. A statue known as America's Response Monument now stands near Ground Zero in New York City in their honor. Unlike traditional invasions, this campaign didn't rely on overwhelming numbers. Instead, the U.S. leveraged brains over brawn-merging strategic vision, SOF versatility, and technological superiority to flip a country in under 90 days. And yet, this would also foreshadow the difficult years to come. The ease with which the Taliban regime fell made it easy to underestimate the complexities of post-conflict Afghanistan. As 2002 arrived, a new insurgency would slowly begin to take root. But for that fleeting moment in late 2001, Task Force Dagger had delivered an unequivocal and historic victory. The initial raids in Afghanistan, culminating in the fall of Kandahar, remain one of the most studied and celebrated case studies in modern military history. It showcased how a handful of highly trained individuals, empowered by advanced tools and flexible doctrine, could change the course of a nation's future in weeks. Task Force Dagger's legacy lives on not only in military textbooks and monuments, but in the DNA of today's special operations missions around the globe. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment so you don't miss out. In September 1970, a U.S.-led Special Operations Force crossed into southern Laos on one of the most unusual missions of the Vietnam War. The mission was called Operation Tailwind. It was covert, politically sensitive, and deep enough into Laos that even decades later, people would still argue over what really happened there. But before getting to the controversy, the first thing to understand is much simpler. Tailwind was not some random raid into the jungle. It was part of a much larger war being fought in the shadows across the trails, valleys, and borderlands that kept North Vietnamese forces supplied across Indochina. And at the center of that hidden war was MACV-SOG. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group was one of the most secretive American organizations of the war. It ran covert cross-border missions into places like Laos and Cambodia, where the fighting mattered enormously, but the politics around that fighting were explosive. This was the world Tailwind came out of. Not the world of large conventional divisions moving openly across maps, but the world of deniable ground teams, irregular troops, intelligence collection, and missions that officially had to remain in the shadows even when everyone involved knew the stakes were strategic. That is what gave Tailwind its purpose. By 1970, Laos had already become one of the most important hidden battlegrounds of the war. Publicly, it was politically delicate territory. In reality, it sat at the center of the enemy's ability to move men, weapons, and supplies through the Ho Chi Minh Trail network. The United States had spent years trying to pressure that system through air power, covert programs, and irregular warfare. Tailwind only makes sense inside that larger hidden war. This was not a conventional American invasion of Laos. It was not a division-sized force pushing openly across a border. It came out of the world of MACV-SOG and the Prairie Fire missions, the cross-border reconnaissance program that sent American-led teams into the Laotian Panhandle to probe enemy routes, gather intelligence, and apply pressure where official U.S. policy could not openly acknowledge the scale of what was happening. Those missions were dangerous even when they were small. Tailwind grew out of that environment, but it went beyond the kind of tiny recon patrol people usually imagine when they hear the phrase secret mission. That is one of the first things to make clear. Tailwind was unusual from the start. It was conducted from 11 to 14 September 1970 in southern Laos. The ground force included 16 U.S. Special Forces-led personnel and about 120 Montagnard troops. For a MACV-SOG operation across the border, that was significant. It was larger, deeper, and more aggressive than the normal recon model. This was not just a few men slipping over the border to watch a trail and radio back what they saw. This was a reconnaissance and force mission with enough manpower to hit, move, and create disruption. And the reason it took that shape comes down to what it was built to do. Tailwind had two main purposes. The first was intelligence collection, the second was diversion. That second purpose is what makes the mission especially important. The force was not only supposed to go into enemy territory and gather valuable information, it was also supposed to draw North Vietnamese attention and resources away from another nearby effort, Operation Gauntlet. That meant Tailwind was operating on two levels at once. On the tactical level, the force had to go in, hit the area, gather intelligence, survive whatever happened, and get back out. On the operational level, the mission had to create enough pressure in one place that the enemy would have to react to it, and in reacting, shift attention away from the wider offensive American-backed forces were trying to support elsewhere in southern Laos. That is why Tailwind was not just a raid. It was a mission with two clocks running at the same time. One clock was immediate and local, the other was wider and strategic. The men on the ground were not just moving through jungle, they were part of a larger effort to complicate enemy defense of the logistics system that kept the war alive. And the area chosen for the mission was not random. Tailwind operated in the southern Laotian Panhandle near the Chavon area, in a zone tied directly to the logistics infrastructure of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. More specifically, it was connected to the 559th Transportation Group, one of the key North Vietnamese organizations responsible for moving and protecting the flow of men and material through Laos. That matters because once you understand the 559th, you understand why Tailwind mattered. The war in Laos was not only about firefights in remote jungle, it was also about the machinery that kept the broader communist war effort functioning. Routes, depots, movement corridors, security forces, and transport networks all mattered. The trail system was not just a path through the jungle, it was a living logistics system. If you wanted to disrupt it, learn from it, or force the enemy to defend it under pressure, this was exactly the kind of place you had to hit. That is the deeper logic behind Tailwind. The mission targeted an area that mattered because the enemy had made it matter. The Chavon region was not important because it was remote. It was important because it sat inside the logistical architecture of the war. Tailwind was aimed at that architecture. It was trying to probe it, pressure it, and learn from it at the same time. That is also why the phrase reconnaissance and force matters so much here. A normal reconnaissance patrol is built around stealth observation and avoiding major engagement if possible. Tailwind was something more aggressive than that. It was still an intelligence mission, but it was an intelligence mission willing to go in with enough force to hit, move, and create disruption, not just watch from the margins. This was not simply sneaking, it was probing with teeth. And because it was doing that under MACV-SOG authority in Laos, the political stakes were higher than the size of the force might suggest. Cross-border operations there existed in a strange and dangerous space. Militarily, they were important. Politically, they were delicate. They had to be handled through special authorities because the whole point was to apply pressure without turning the hidden war in Laos into an even larger public crisis. That meant Tailwind was not only dangerous because of enemy contact, it was dangerous because failure would have consequences far beyond the men on the ground. If helicopters were lost, if Americans were captured, if the mission became too visible, the fallout would not stay in the jungle. That is why Tailwind carried more weight than its numbers alone might suggest. It was a small force, but it was going in deep, crossing a politically sensitive border, targeting a critical logistics zone, and serving a diversion role tied to a larger offensive. That combination gave the mission its gravity. It also explains why higher leadership knew about it. This was not some forgotten patrol improvised at the edge of the war. It sat inside a broader campaign logic. It was unusual enough in both size and depth that it drew attention at senior levels. In other words, Tailwind was part of a larger design, not an isolated jungle gamble. So when people hear the name Operation Tailwind, they should not start with the later myths or scandals. They should start here. A covert US-led force from MACV-SOG crossed into southern Laos in September 1970 as part of the larger hidden war around the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was sent to gather intelligence and create diversion at the same time. And it was bigger, deeper, and more aggressive than the kind of border reconnaissance mission people usually picture when they hear the words secret operation. That is the real starting point. Operation Tailwind was not just a recon patrol. It was a deeper MACV-SOG covert mission built to collect intelligence, disrupt the enemy, and create pressure in one of the most important logistical battle spaces of the war. And once the force went in, it did not stay quiet for long. The insertion itself came under fire. As the helicopters brought the force into the target area on September 11th, the team took small arms fire during insertion. That detail matters because it tells you the mission did not begin with concealment. The enemy was active from the start. The force was not slipping into empty jungle. It was entering contested ground where contact could build fast, and where every minute on the ground increased the chance that the mission would turn from covert operation into open battle. That battle developed quickly. One of the earliest reported successes of the mission was the discovery and destruction of an enemy ammunition dump. That tells you two things at once. First, the target area really did matter. Second, the force was already operating aggressively enough to do more than just observe. Tailwind had gone in to gather intelligence and create pressure, and almost immediately it was doing both by damaging enemy supplies and forcing a response. This is where the operation starts to separate itself from the image of a cautious reconnaissance patrol. MACV-SOG had sent teams across borders before, but Tailwind was not just there to watch. It was there to hit, move, and unsettle the enemy in his own rear area. And once that happened, the mission began to turn into something harsher. Official summaries describe almost continuous contact for roughly 72 hours. That phrase is one of the most important in the entire story. It means the force was not fighting one sharp engagement and then breaking clean. It means the men on the ground were under repeated pressure over multiple days, while deep inside Laos, trying to move, survive, stay organized, and avoid being overwhelmed before extraction could take place. That is the real shape of Tailwind. Not a hidden movement from point to point, but a running fight in hostile territory with no easy way out. That is also why air power became central to the mission. Tailwind depended heavily on helicopters, close air support, and command and control aircraft overhead. This was not just helpful backup, it was one of the reasons the force survived at all. Marine CH-53 helicopters handled insertion and later extraction attempts. Gunships supported the mission. Air Force aircraft under 7th Air Force control flew 76 sorties in support of Tailwind, while forward air control and airborne command and control helped keep the mission functioning as the ground situation worsened. That means the force in Laos was never fighting alone. Above it was an entire support structure trying to keep a small MACV-SOG-led force alive inside contested territory. Tailwind may have been covert on paper, but once the battle developed, it was not small in intensity. The ground force was small, but the fight around it was not. Helicopters were moving in and out under pressure, gunships were involved. Tactical air support kept being used, command and control aircraft were helping manage a mission that was becoming harder to contain by the hour. That is not a quiet sneaking mission. That is a small force fighting to stay alive while the whole machinery of covert air support tries to keep it from being destroyed. And the deeper the operation went, the more extraction became the real issue. At the start, Tailwind had been about intelligence collection and diversion. But once the force was under near continuous contact, the mission was no longer just about what it could gather or destroy. It was also about whether the men on the ground could hold together long enough for aviation to get them out. That is where the operation becomes especially dramatic. The farther the team got into the fight, the more the mission turned into a contest between enemy pressure and the ability of helicopters and air support to prevent encirclement or collapse. That pressure came to a head during extraction. The report makes clear that the key extraction attempts happened on the 13th and 14th of September. The first serious attempt on the 13th of September failed. The next day, on the 14th of September, the final extraction succeeded. That detail is critical because it shows Tailwind did not simply fight its way to a clean pickup. The force had to endure a failed extraction first, which meant more time under fire, more exposure, more wounded men, and more dependence on air support in an already punishing situation. This is where the mission really stops looking like a covert reconnaissance action and starts looking like a trapped force fighting its way toward evacuation. The cost reflects that. Official friendly casualty reporting described 3 Montagnards killed, 33 Montagnards wounded, and 16 U.S. personnel wounded, with no U.S. killed. One contemporaneous evaluation gave a slightly different wounded total, but the larger point does not change. The force came out battered, the indigenous troops paid a real price, and the American side was hit hard enough that official review described every U.S. serviceman on the mission as wounded. That is an extraordinary measure of how intense the fighting had become. This was not a mission where a few men took hits and the rest walked away clean. Tailwind was a mission where the entire force was mauled by the effort to stay alive and get out. The aviation losses underline that reality. Official records cited in the report list the loss of 2 Marine CH-53D helicopters and 1 Army AH-1G. In a mission like this, aircraft losses are not side notes. They are proof of how dangerous the extraction battle had become. Every helicopter lost meant more danger for the force on the ground and more visibility for a mission that was supposed to remain politically hidden. A covert operation is easier to contain when it stays quiet. Downed aircraft and a running extraction battle make that much harder. There were also official enemy casualty claims that ran much higher, along with claims of significant damage to enemy material. But those numbers should be handled carefully. They were wartime official estimates, not independently verified totals, and the truth is, the mission does not need inflated body counts to feel dramatic. The verified shape of Tailwind is already dramatic enough. A deep cross-border insertion, contact from the start, an ammunition dump destroyed early, nearly 3 days of continuous fighting, heavy dependence on helicopters and tactical air power, a failed extraction attempt, a final extraction under intense pressure, wounded across the force, aircraft shot down. That is already a brutal story. Tailwind did not remain the kind of mission it was designed to be. It began as a MACV-SOG reconnaissance and force operation. It turned into a sustained 4-day fight, and by the end, survival depended on whether helicopters and air power could pull a battered covert force out of Laos under fire. That is the heart of the battle. Operation Tailwind was not a quiet, sneaking mission. It became a brutal survival fight shaped by constant enemy contact, failed extraction, wounded men, downed aircraft, and overwhelming dependence on air power to keep the force from being destroyed. But for all that, the mission would later become famous for something else entirely. Years later, people would remember Operation Tailwind less for the 4-day fight than for the gas controversy that followed it. By the time Operation Tailwind ended, the mission had already become far more than a simple cross-border patrol. It had begun as a MACV-SOG reconnaissance and force mission into southern Laos, but after days of near-continuous contact, it ended as both a survival story and an intelligence success. That is the part that matters most here. Tailwind was not launched just to move through the jungle and come back with impressions. It was sent in to gather intelligence and create pressure at the same time. And despite the cost of the fighting, the mission appears to have done both. One of the most important results was the capture of a large body of enemy documents. A Joint Chiefs evaluation credited Tailwind with seizing 851 pages of enemy material, with 400 pages judged highly significant. That haul was considered unusually valuable intelligence on the 559th Transportation Group, the North Vietnamese organization deeply tied to logistics and movement through the Laos Panhandle. That matters because it brings the story back to the original purpose of the operation. Tailwind had gone into one of the most important logistical battle spaces of the war. It was aimed at an area connected to the Ho Chi Minh Trail system and the enemy infrastructure that kept men, weapons, and supplies moving. So when the force came out with documents tied to that network, it meant the mission had done more than survive. It had actually produced intelligence that senior officials considered highly valuable. The mission also appears to have helped at the wider operational level. Tailwind was designed not only to gather intelligence, but also to act as a diversion linked to Operation Gauntlet. The idea was to create enough pressure in one place that North Vietnamese forces would have to react, shifting attention away from the larger irregular offensive elsewhere in southern Laos. Official assessments later argued that Tailwind likely did contribute in that role by drawing off some enemy focus and manpower. That is what gives the operation its real weight. Tailwind was costly, it was violent, it pushed a small force to its limit, but it was not meaningless. It produced a valuable intelligence return, it applied pressure in a critical logistical zone, and it served a larger purpose inside the hidden war in Laos. So the best way to understand Operation Tailwind is this. It was a covert MACV-SOG mission that turned into a brutal 4-day fight, but it was also a mission that appears to have delivered what it was sent in to deliver: pressure on the enemy and intelligence that mattered. In early October 2017, an American Special Operations team was preparing for what was expected to be a routine mission in the West African nation of Niger. Their goal? To gather intelligence, meet with local leaders, and disrupt ISIS-linked militant activity in the region. What they didn't know was that this mission would end in one of the deadliest attacks on U.S. forces in Africa in recent history, sparking international attention, political controversy, and intense scrutiny over America's growing presence in the Sahel. The story of the Tongo Tongo ambush begins in the vast arid landscape near the Mali-Niger border. This region is part of the Sahel, a semi-arid band of land stretching across the continent just south of the Sahara Desert. It's a lawless and unstable area where extremist groups like ISIS in the Greater Sahara ISGS, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and various tribal militias operate with near impunity. By 2017, the U.S. had quietly increased its military footprint in Niger. Though not officially at war, American forces had partnered with local militaries in an effort to train, advise, and assist regional forces and prevent the expansion of terrorist groups. One of these partner forces was a small detachment from the Nigerian Army, working alongside U.S. Army Special Forces, better known as the Green Berets. On October 3rd, a joint patrol of 11 U.S. soldiers from Operational Detachment Alpha 3212, along with approximately 30 Nigerian soldiers, left their base near Wallam, headed toward the village of Tiloa. Their initial task was to meet with local tribal elders to gather intelligence about the whereabouts of Dondushifu, an ISGS commander suspected of involvement in several regional attacks and possibly linked to the kidnapping of a Western aid worker. According to the mission briefing, this was a low-risk operation. There were no expectations of enemy contact. The team, lightly armed and traveling in unarmored vehicles, was not outfitted for direct action. They had no drone support and limited air cover. Nonetheless, they proceeded into a volatile region known for cross-border insurgent activity. After reaching the village and completing their meeting, they were informed that Shefu may be hiding in the vicinity of the Mali border. Higher command then ordered a shift in mission objectives. The team was instructed to proceed further north to investigate the intelligence. This was where the problems began. There was confusion about mission parameters, a lack of clear coordination, and minimal ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. Despite these gaps, the team pushed on. By the early morning of October 4th, after spending several hours in the field with no sighting of Shefu, the team was told to begin their return journey to base. As they approached the village of Tongo Tongo, the Nigerian troops stopped to resupply with water and speak with locals. The pause lasted longer than expected. Some locals appeared nervous, and unknown to the Americans, word of their presence had already reached enemy ears. At approximately 11:40 a.m., just outside Tongo Tongo, the joint patrol was ambushed. Dozens of enemy fighters, estimated between 50 to 100, emerged from the bush and tree lines on motorcycles and foot, armed with AK pattern rifles, PKM machine guns, and RPGs. It was a well-planned and coordinated attack. The militants had chosen their ground carefully, flanking both sides of the convoy and striking with speed and aggression. Caught in the open, the U.S. and Nigerian forces scrambled to find cover behind their vehicles and return fire. But they were severely outgunned and outnumbered. Their convoy lacked armored vehicles, and they had no immediate backup. Communication with headquarters was hampered by poor satellite signal and confusion. To make matters worse, the team did not initially receive air support as no armed drone or nearby air assets were available at the time of contact. The soldiers split into smaller fire teams to defend their position and repel the attackers. In the chaos, Staff Sergeant Brian Black, Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson, and Staff Sergeant Dustin Wright were killed during the firefight. Sergeant LaDavid Johnson became separated from the group in the confusion. His disappearance would later become a central part of the controversy surrounding the mission. Overhead, after a delay, an unarmed drone arrived on station and began providing visual feed to commanders, but without weapons, it could do little to assist directly. French Mirage jets were later scrambled from a nearby base in Mali and conducted a low pass to scatter the attackers, but they were not permitted to engage without visual confirmation of enemy combatants. As the firefight continued, surviving team members attempted to recover their wounded and locate missing personnel. At one point, the team made a call for a medical evacuation, but the delay in confirmation and lack of armed escort delayed response. Despite being wounded, American and Nigerian troops held their ground for over an hour. Eventually, with air support arriving and the enemy dispersing, the team managed to extract, but the losses were significant. 4 American soldiers were killed and several others wounded. It was one of the deadliest attacks on U.S. forces in Africa since the 1993 Battle of Mogadishu. Back home, the news of the ambush triggered a political firestorm. Lawmakers questioned the mission planning, intelligence gaps, and whether the soldiers had been given adequate support. The Gold Star families demanded answers. Investigations were launched, and the Pentagon released a detailed report months later. But questions lingered. Why were these men sent into hostile territory without proper air cover? Why was the mission altered mid-operation, and who ultimately bore responsibility? These are the questions that shaped the narrative after Tongo Tongo. But before we dive into the fallout and the actions of the men on the ground that day, we must first understand the bigger picture. This ambush was not a random event, it was a consequence of an expanding battlefield, unclear objectives, and evolving threats. And, for the men of ODA 3212, it was a mission that would change their lives forever. The dust had barely settled in the Nigerian village of Tongo Tongo when U.S. and Nigerian forces realized the mission had taken a catastrophic turn. The ambush, that left 4 American soldiers dead and several wounded, would send shockwaves through the military and political spheres in both Africa and the United States. But in the immediate aftermath, one mystery loomed above all else. One man was still missing. After the firefight with ISIS-GS militants had raged for over an hour, the American and Nigerian team managed to regroup and escape the kill zone using the cover of gunfire and smoke. As they broke contact and withdrew south of the ambush site, it became apparent that one member of their team had not made it back, Sergeant LaDavid Johnson, a 25-year-old soldier assigned to the 3rd Special Forces Group. The initial confusion was understandable. During the ambush, vehicles had been hit and soldiers had dismounted and taken cover in different directions. The team had limited visibility, no overhead ISR support at the time of contact, and little situational awareness. Once out of contact, a frantic effort began to account for all personnel. When Johnson's absence was confirmed, a recovery and search mission kicked into full gear. Time was critical. The terrain in and around Tongo Tongo was vast, arid, and covered in dense vegetation in some areas. The enemy was mobile and familiar with the land. As the QRF, Quick Reaction Force, and French Mirage jets began to arrive on station, ISR assets were directed to scan the area. French and U.S. Special Operations Forces were flown in to support the search. Drones were redirected from other missions to comb through potential hiding spots. Nigerian troops swept through villages and bushland. Locals were questioned. The fear wasn't just that Sergeant Johnson had been killed in action, there was a rising concern that he may have been captured. France had a large counterterrorism presence in West Africa under Operation Barkhane, and their rapid coordination with American command was instrumental in providing air cover and mobility. French helicopters and jets were among the first to respond, providing overwatch and medical evacuation for wounded troops. Despite the language barrier and the friction of multinational coordination in a fluid environment, French and U.S. teams managed to work in unison. Still, ground assets remained limited in the critical hours after the ambush. The rugged terrain slowed progress, and the possibility of enemy fighters still lurking nearby made every movement dangerous. It would take nearly 48 hours before Johnson's remains were found. His body was located by Nigerian villagers, roughly 1 kilometer from the site of the initial ambush. Forensic evidence would later suggest he had been separated from the main element during the firefight and attempted to break contact on foot. He was likely engaged by ISIS-GS fighters while evading capture. Reports indicated that he had been shot multiple times, and his body was found with evidence that he had fought to the end. The delay in recovering his body would become a central issue in the public scrutiny that followed. Questions emerged: why did it take so long to locate him? And was the U.S. military unprepared for this kind of contact in Niger? Why was a Special Forces team operating in such a hostile area with limited air support and no ISR at the start of the mission? News of the deaths, particularly that of Sergeant Johnson, who was African-American and from Miami, sparked national attention. His widow, Maishia Johnson, became a central figure in a political firestorm when a condolence call from President Donald Trump was criticized for its tone. The controversy widened an already growing public interest in the mission, with many Americans asking, what were our troops doing in Niger? Congress requested classified briefings. The Pentagon released a timeline of events. The ambush, which had previously gone unnoticed by the wider public, suddenly became a litmus test for U.S. military operations in Africa. Analysts began to question the scope of AFRICOM's activities and the resources available for special forces in the Sahel. Inside the Department of Defense, the Tongo Tongo ambush triggered a full review of operational planning and mission approvals. Criticisms included, the mission had changed scope multiple times before execution. The team lacked immediate access to ISR, CAS, close air support, and a QRF. The intelligence on the enemy presence in the area had been underestimated. There was poor communications infrastructure in case of emergencies. Changes were made in how similar missions would be greenlit in the future. Risk assessment protocols were tightened. U.S. Special Forces teams began operating with better contingency planning, air support guarantees, and closer integration with partner forces. Despite the controversy, the bravery of those involved could not be denied. The 4 soldiers who died, Staff Sergeant Brian Black, Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Johnson, Staff Sergeant Dustin Wright, and Sergeant David Johnson, were posthumously awarded Bronze Stars with Valor, among other recognitions. Accounts from surviving team members and Nigerian allies describe heroic efforts to hold off the enemy, evacuate wounded, and recover remains under fire. One Special Forces soldier was wounded but refused evacuation until his teammates were safe. Staff Sergeant Wright and Johnson reportedly attempted to drag each other to safety before being overrun. Their actions speak to the bonds forged in combat and the ethos of the Green Berets: never leave a man behind, even at great personal risk. The Tongo Tongo ambush aftermath was not just a recovery mission, it was a brutal wake-up call for the risks U.S. forces face in shadow war zones far from the spotlight. The loss of Sergeant Johnson and the other team members underscored the volatility of operations in Africa's Sahel region, where extremist groups operate across porous borders, and U.S. forces work with local allies in murky combat environments. Yet, even in failure, the resolve of the men who fought that day, and those who came to recover them, became a somber reminder of duty, sacrifice, and the human cost of irregular warfare. In the late 1970s, El Salvador was already unraveling. The country was small, barely the size of Massachusetts, but its political fault lines ran deep. For decades, power had been concentrated in the hands of a military-backed elite. Land ownership was highly unequal. Political opposition was often met with repression. By the end of the decade, social unrest had transformed into organized resistance. Leftist groups, labor movements, student organizations, and rural activists began uniting under a broader revolutionary umbrella. In 1980, several guerrilla factions formally consolidated into the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, known as the FMLN. What began as protests and political agitation hardened into armed insurgency. The Salvadoran Civil War had begun. The government responded with force. Security services, military units, and shadowy paramilitary networks moved aggressively against suspected insurgents. Violence escalated quickly. Political assassinations, bombings, kidnappings, and retaliatory killings became routine. Civilians were caught between the insurgency and a state apparatus determined to crush it. To many Salvadorans, this was a struggle over land, power, and justice. To Washington, it was something else entirely. In 1979, just across the border in Nicaragua, a leftist revolution had toppled the U.S.-backed Somoza regime. The Sandinistas had taken power, and the shockwaves were still reverberating through Central America. Policymakers in the United States saw a pattern forming, one that felt uncomfortably familiar. The Cold War was entering a new phase. The Soviet Union remained active globally. Cuba had long supported revolutionary movements in Latin America. Intelligence reports suggested that external actors were supplying or encouraging leftist movements in the region. Whether exaggerated or not, the perception mattered. El Salvador was no longer just a domestic conflict. It became a strategic test. If another Central American government fell to a Marxist insurgency, U.S. credibility in the Western Hemisphere could weaken. Policymakers feared a domino effect: El Salvador today, Guatemala tomorrow, instability spreading northward. But this was 1980, not 1965. Vietnam had left scars on American political life. Large-scale U.S. deployments were deeply unpopular. The idea of sending divisions of American soldiers into another jungle war was politically toxic. Congress was wary, the public was skeptical, yet doing nothing was also viewed as unacceptable. Inside Washington, the question was not whether to respond, but how. The answer would define the next decade. Instead of invasion, the United States chose influence. Instead of combat brigades, it would send advisors. Instead of owning the war, it would help the Salvadoran government fight its own. This approach had a name within military doctrine: foreign internal defense. The concept was straightforward in theory: train and assist a partner nation's military, improve its professionalism, increase its ability to counter insurgents, stabilize the government without direct American combat operations. In practice, it was far more complicated. By 1980 and 1981, the violence in El Salvador was intensifying. The FMLN launched coordinated offensives, infrastructure was attacked, military targets were ambushed, the government struggled to control rural areas, intelligence was inconsistent, units were poorly trained, coordination was weak. American officials believed the Salvadoran armed forces needed restructuring, not reinforcement by U.S. troops, but transformation from within. That transformation would not come from conventional army units. It would come from the U.S. Army Special Forces, the Green Berets. Unlike traditional infantry units, Special Forces were designed specifically for advisory missions. Their training emphasized language skills, cultural familiarity, small team operations, and working alongside foreign militaries. Their mission profile fit the political constraints of the moment. Washington imposed a strict limit on U.S. military personnel inside El Salvador. At one point, that cap stood at just 55 advisors. No combat battalions, no large bases, no American-led offensives. Officially, they would not fight, they would train, they would advise, they would observe. This small footprint was intentional. It allowed the United States to remain involved without appearing to wage war. It reduced domestic backlash. It limited exposure. It kept the conflict, at least publicly, a Salvadoran fight. But even a small footprint carries weight. By the early 1980s, American advisors began rotating into El Salvador. They worked to professionalize Salvadoran units. Training focused on small unit tactics, leadership development, intelligence coordination, and mobility. Helicopter integration became a priority. Rapid reaction capabilities were emphasized. The goal was to create units capable of responding quickly to guerrilla attacks rather than relying on slow reactive operations. This was counterinsurgency in real time. The war itself remained brutal. Guerrillas operated from mountainous terrain and rural strongholds. They blended into sympathetic communities. The Salvadoran military often responded with heavy-handed sweeps. Lines between insurgent and civilian were frequently blurred. And this is where tension entered the mission. American advisors did not control Salvadoran forces. They influenced them. They trained them. But they did not command them. The Salvadoran military carried its own history, one shaped by repression and internal power struggles. In Washington, officials framed the advisory mission as a stabilizing force. By improving training and discipline, they argued, U.S. involvement could reduce indiscriminate violence and make operations more precise. Critics feared the opposite. If U.S. training enhanced the effectiveness of units already accused of abuses, would it simply make them more lethal? These debates were not abstract. News reports began highlighting human rights concerns. Investigations raised questions about links between security forces and paramilitary groups. Congressional hearings probed the extent of U.S. oversight. Yet the broader strategic calculation remained unchanged. El Salvador was viewed as a front line in the Cold War. The United States would not invade. It would not openly occupy. It would not declare war. Instead, it would operate through influence, training, and advisory presence. This approach, limited, indirect, politically calibrated, represented a shift in how America engaged overseas conflicts. It reflected the lessons of Vietnam and the realities of domestic politics, but it also carried inherent risks: influence without control, presence without ownership, support without full accountability. By the mid-1980s, the war in El Salvador had settled into a grinding stalemate. The Salvadoran military was more organized than it had been at the start of the conflict. Rapid reaction battalions could deploy faster. Air mobility allowed quicker insertion into contested zones. Intelligence systems were more structured. Tactical coordination had improved. But the insurgency had not collapsed. The FMLN remained resilient. They adapted, they shifted tactics. They moved through rural corridors, maintained urban networks, and leveraged propaganda to undermine the government's legitimacy. For every tactical gain, there was another ambush, another sabotage operation, another reminder that insurgencies are rarely defeated by force alone. Meanwhile, outside the battlefield, another war was unfolding, this one political. Reports of human rights abuses drew international attention. Death squads, Paramilitary groups linked to elements within the Salvadoran security apparatus were implicated in kidnappings, assassinations, and massacres. Some of the most notorious incidents, including the killing of civilians in rural villages, became flashpoints in the global media. In Washington, congressional hearings examined whether U.S. support was indirectly enabling abuses. Critics argued that training and equipping Salvadoran units risked strengthening forces accused of brutality. Supporters countered that U.S. involvement actually restrained excesses by professionalizing the military and imposing oversight standards. The truth existed in tension. American advisors did not command Salvadoran units. They could recommend procedures. They could emphasize discipline and rules of engagement. They could push for intelligence-based targeting instead of indiscriminate sweeps. But ultimate authority remained local. This was the core dilemma of foreign internal defense. Influence is not control. The advisory mission operated inside a sovereign country with its own political structures, internal divisions, and historical grievances. Reforming institutions amid active civil war is not a linear process. As the conflict dragged on through the late 1980s, the strategic environment began to shift. The global Cold War itself was cooling. Soviet influence in Latin America waned. Regional diplomatic efforts intensified. Negotiations, once dismissed, became more plausible. By the early 1990s, momentum moved toward a political settlement. In 1992, after 12 years of war, the Chapultepec Peace Accords were signed. The agreement demobilized guerrilla forces, restructured the Salvadoran military, and integrated the FMLN into the political system. The Civil War formally ended. From a narrow Cold War perspective, U.S. objectives had been achieved. El Salvador did not become a Marxist-aligned state. The government survived. There was no American invasion, no massive U.S. casualty list, no prolonged occupation. For proponents of the small footprint strategy, El Salvador became an example of how limited advisory missions could stabilize an allied government without large-scale intervention. But the cost was undeniable. The war had lasted over a decade. Tens of thousands of Salvadorans were killed, entire communities were displaced, trust in institutions eroded, violence left psychological and social scars that would linger long after the ceasefire. In the years following the war, El Salvador faced new challenges. Economic strain, weak institutions, and social fragmentation contributed to rising criminal violence. Migration increased. Many Salvadorans fled to the United States during and after the conflict. In diaspora communities, new dynamics emerged, including the formation of gangs that would later become transnational criminal organizations. History does not move in straight lines. The advisory mission did not create these outcomes alone, nor did it operate in isolation from local agency, but it became part of a chain of events that shaped regional stability for decades. Inside the U.S. military, lessons from El Salvador were studied carefully. Special Forces doctrine emphasized that small advisory teams could amplify local forces significantly. Mobility, intelligence fusion, and leadership development were critical in counterinsurgency. The model would later resurface in Iraq and Afghanistan, where U.S. advisors again worked to train partner forces against insurgencies. El Salvador became an early case study in modern limited engagement. It demonstrated that the United States could influence a war without dominating it. It showed that small teams could reshape tactical capacity. It also revealed the inherent limits of advisory warfare. Training can improve tactics. It cannot resolve political fractures. Advisors can shape operations. They cannot erase the social roots of insurgency. By the time the last American advisors rotated out, the mission had evolved from emergency stabilization to long-term institutional reform. The small footprint had endured for over a decade. And yet, the questions remained. Was the war shortened or prolonged? Did professionalization reduce abuses or merely shift their form? Was the prevention of revolutionary takeover worth the human cost? There are no simple answers. El Salvador stands as a case study in the complexity of proxy conflict during the Cold War. It was not a conventional invasion, it was not a covert coup, it was a sustained advisory effort embedded inside a brutal civil war. 55 advisors at a time. No large U.S. combat formations, no dramatic battlefield victories, just steady influence in the shadows. Before Iraq, before Afghanistan, before small footprint became a strategic buzzword. There was El Salvador, a quiet war, fought indirectly, with consequences that extended far beyond its borders. By the spring of 1970, the Vietnam War had entered a new and volatile phase. American troop levels were beginning to decline under the policy of Vietnamization, yet the conflict itself showed no signs of ending. The Paris peace talks dragged on without breakthrough, and inside North Vietnam, hundreds of American prisoners of war remained in captivity. For their families, the silence was agonizing. For the Nixon administration, it was a growing political and moral crisis. Reports suggested that by 1970, roughly 400 American POWs were being held in camps across North Vietnam. Letters were sporadic, information was scarce, public pressure mounted as POW advocacy groups demanded action. In May 1970, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird directed an intensified intelligence effort to locate prisoner camps and assess rescue feasibility. The order marked the beginning of what would become one of the most daring special operations missions of the Vietnam War. Intelligence analysts soon focused on a compound west of Hanoi, near the town of Sante. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed what appeared to be a prison facility, a walled compound with guard towers and rows of small buildings. In some imagery, POW uniforms were seen hanging to dry. Human intelligence sources and reconnaissance reports suggested that approximately 61 American prisoners were being held there. The intelligence picture was not perfect, but it was persuasive enough to justify serious planning. The concept was audacious. Insert a small, highly trained force deep into North Vietnam, land by helicopter inside the prison compound, neutralize the guards, extract the prisoners, and escape before enemy reinforcements could react. It would be a high-risk raid conducted roughly 23 miles from Hanoi, well within the heart of enemy-controlled territory. Success would bring American prisoners home. Failure could mean heavy casualties and severe diplomatic consequences. To execute such a mission, planners needed the most experienced special operations personnel available. A joint task force was assembled known as Joint Task Force 1, integrating Army Special Forces, Air Force Combat Aviation Units, Navy strike aircraft, and CIA intelligence support. The ground assault element consisted of 56 U.S. Army Special Forces Green Berets drawn primarily from the 5th Special Forces Group. They were organized into 3 assault elements: Blue Boy, Red Wine, and Goldstein. Command of the mission fell to Colonel Arthur Bull Simons, a veteran of World War II and Korea known for discipline and precision. On the ground, Lieutenant Colonel Eldon Bargewell would help lead the assault force. These were not ordinary advisors. They were operators selected for a deep penetration strike in hostile territory, where survival depended on speed, coordination, and absolute trust in the plan. Air support would be critical. The insertion would rely on U.S. Air Force HH-53 Super Jolly Green Giant helicopters capable of carrying assault teams into confined landing zones. Additional aircraft, and including F-4 Phantom fighters, Navy A-6 Intruders, and even B-52 bombers, would suppress nearby anti-aircraft defenses before the raid commenced. The scale of supporting firepower underscored the seriousness of the operation. Though only 56 men would land inside the prison, the full weight of joint American air power would stand behind them. Planning began in earnest during the summer of 1970. Intelligence from CIA sources and MACV-SOG reconnaissance teams contributed to a detailed picture of the Sante compound. The CIA's Project Vic coordinated analysis of aerial photographs and ground reports. Rehearsals were conducted at Tak Lee Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand, where a full-scale mock-up of the prison compound was constructed. Every wall, gate, and building was replicated to ensure the raiders could memorize the layout. The rehearsals were relentless. The assault plan called for helicopters to land inside the outer walls, with Green Berets breaching structures and clearing buildings in under 2 minutes. The goal was speed and shock. Overwhelm the guards before they could organize resistance. Every second was scripted. The operation was designed to be completed in approximately 26 minutes from insertion to extraction. Security was tight. Troops were kept isolated to prevent leaks. Some aircraft conducted deceptive flights over South Vietnam to mask the timing of the mission. Navigation would rely on night vision devices, compass headings, and precise timing. GPS did not exist in 1970. The margin for error was minimal. North Vietnamese forces in the region were estimated at 150 to 400 troops within a short reaction distance. Surface-to-air missile sites and anti-aircraft artillery were present nearby. Colonel Simons addressed the assembled raiders before final deployment. According to accounts, he told them there was a 50-50 chance of not making it back. The warning was not dramatic flourish, it reflected reality. Penetrating North Vietnam carried extraordinary risk. If helicopters were shot down or if reinforcements arrived too quickly, extraction could fail. Despite the risk, morale within the task force remained high. The mission carried a powerful ethical dimension. The United States had long maintained the principle of leave no man behind. Rescuing POWs was not merely strategic, it was moral. Even if the raid did not succeed, demonstrating the willingness to attempt such a rescue could influence prisoner treatment and signal resolve to both Hanoi and the American public. As November approached, weather patterns were studied carefully. Moon phase, cloud cover, and visibility would determine the optimal launch window. After final rehearsals and adjustments, the mission was set for the night of November 20th to 21st, 1970. In the hours before launch, the 56 Green Berets prepared their equipment. M16 rifles, grenades, demolition charges, breaching tools. Each man carried only what was necessary for a rapid assault. The objective was clear: land, clear, rescue, and extract. Shortly after midnight on November 21st, 1970, helicopters lifted off from Thai bases, flying low and fast toward North Vietnam. Above and around them, supporting aircraft prepared to strike anti-aircraft positions and illuminate the target area. The most daring POW rescue attempt of the Vietnam War was underway. Within minutes, the raiders would be inside the walls of Sante prison, executing a plan rehearsed hundreds of times. What they did not yet know was that the intelligence picture, so carefully assembled over months, concealed a critical flaw. The cells they were about to storm were empty. Inside the lead helicopters, the 56 Green Berets of Joint Task Force 1 sat in silence. Organized into 3 assault elements, Blue Boy, Red Wine, and Goldstein, they had rehearsed this moment countless times at Tak Ly Air Base in Thailand. Every building inside the Sante compound had been memorized. Every movement inside the walls had been practiced down to the second. The plan was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Land inside the prison, neutralize the guards, free the prisoners, and extract in under 30 minutes. At approximately 0:12, the first helicopter descended into the prison compound itself. In a deliberate maneuver designed during rehearsals, the aircraft landed inside the outer walls, a direct insertion that would eliminate the need to breach from outside. The Blue Boy element disembarked immediately, fanning out across the courtyard with rifles ready. Simultaneously, other helicopters inserted the Red Wine and Goldstein teams into positions outside and along the perimeter. Their tasks were to eliminate guard towers, secure outer buildings, and block any rapid response by North Vietnamese forces stationed nearby. Timing was critical. Intelligence estimated that enemy troops within a 15-minute radius could mount a counterattack. The entire operation depended on speed. As rehearsed, breaching charges were placed against the compound gates. Bangalore torpedoes blasted openings through walls and fences. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness as Green Berets engaged the few guards who attempted resistance. The raiders used M16 rifles, grenade launchers, submachine guns, and demolition charges to clear structures with overwhelming force. Within seconds, the courtyard was secured. Above, flare ships illuminated the compound, casting stark white light across rooftops and walls. The contrast between darkness and sudden brightness heightened the surreal intensity of the moment. Every second counted. The assault teams moved toward the prisoner housing area, where intelligence had placed approximately 61 American POWs. Doors were kicked open, rooms were cleared, and then came the first signs of something wrong. The cells were empty. Blue Boy methodically swept the western section of the compound, while Red Wine and Goldstein cleared adjacent buildings. No prisoners, no American voices, no signs of recent occupancy beyond structural remains. The bunks stood vacant. The facility that had appeared full of life in aerial photographs was silent. Outside the walls, limited resistance continued. Some North Vietnamese guards had been killed during the initial assault, and small arms fire echoed in the distance. A C-130 gunships and tactical aircraft circled overhead, prepared to suppress any organized counterattack. But the core objective, rescue of American prisoners, had not been achieved. Colonel Simons and the ground commanders faced a rapid decision. The plan did not allow for prolonged occupation. If prisoners were not present, the raiders were to withdraw immediately. The window for safe extraction was narrow. Remaining inside the compound would only increase the chance of encirclement by North Vietnamese forces. Confirmation spread quickly across radios. The POW housing was empty. Intelligence had failed to account for a relocation that had occurred months earlier, likely in July 1970. The carefully rehearsed operation had hit the right target at the wrong time. Despite the shock, discipline held. The raiders completed a final sweep of the compound to ensure no prisoners were hidden or overlooked. Secondary objectives, including destruction of guard facilities, were executed swiftly. The teams then began controlled withdrawal toward the designated extraction zone known as Landing Zone Stinson. By approximately 0026, the withdrawal was underway. Helicopters returned under continued air cover. Tracers flashed sporadically in the night, but no major enemy assault materialized. The North Vietnamese reaction, though present, did not escalate quickly enough to trap the raiders. Within roughly 26 minutes of insertion, the assault force was lifting off. The final helicopters departed around midnight 46, carrying all 56 Green Berets safely away from the compound. One helicopter experienced difficulties during return and crash-landed, but the crew survived with minor injuries. No American personnel were killed during the raid. The zero-fatality outcome was remarkable for an operation conducted deep inside hostile territory. By approximately 300, Joint Task Force 1 had returned to bases in Thailand. The immediate tactical picture was clear. The insertion had been precise. The assault had been executed exactly as rehearsed. The extraction had succeeded within the planned time window. The operation had demonstrated extraordinary joint coordination between Army Special Forces, Air Force Aviation, Navy strike assets, and CIA intelligence support. Yet the primary objective, rescuing prisoners, remained unmet. Debriefings confirmed what the empty cells had revealed. The POWs had been moved months earlier. Intelligence had located the correct facility, but failed to update prisoner status in time. What would later be described as the perfect raid on the wrong camp had unfolded exactly according to plan, except for the one variable that mattered most. Still, something significant had occurred. The United States had demonstrated that it could penetrate North Vietnamese defenses at will. It had inserted and extracted forces within minutes of Hanoi without losing a single man. The psychological and strategic implications were only beginning to unfold. For the Green Berets who stormed Sante that night, the mission had proven their training and coordination beyond doubt. For the POWs still held elsewhere in North Vietnam, news of the raid would soon carry a different kind of impact. The operation had not brought anyone home, but it had changed the war's dynamics in ways that were not immediately visible in the darkness over Sante. When the helicopters carrying the Sante raiders touched down back in Thailand in the early hours of November 21, 1970, the immediate tactical picture was clear. The operation had been executed almost flawlessly. 56 Green Berets had penetrated deep into North Vietnam, assaulted a fortified prison compound, and extracted without a single American killed in action. The timing had held. The coordination between Army Special Forces, Air Force Aviation, Navy strike aircraft, and CIA intelligence support had functioned exactly as rehearsed. But the mission's core objective, rescuing approximately 61 American POWs believed to be held at Sante, had not been achieved. The prison cells were empty. The prisoners had been relocated months earlier, likely in July 1970. In a war defined by intelligence battles as much as firefights, that detail would shape the historical legacy of the raid. The immediate question became unavoidable: how had the intelligence picture failed? Prior to the operation, aerial reconnaissance had identified the Sante compound as an active POW facility. Photographs showed structures consistent with prison housing, and earlier reports indicated prisoner presence. SOG reconnaissance teams and CIA analysis had supported the assessment. From a planning standpoint, the rationale appeared sound. Yet post-raid analysis revealed contradictory information within intelligence channels. Some aerial imagery from mid-1970 suggested that the POW population had already been moved. Whether that information was discounted, misinterpreted, or overshadowed by earlier assessments remains a point of debate. Critics later described Sante as the perfect raid on the wrong camp. The phrase captured the paradox: the assault had been tactically precise. The failure lay not in execution, but in the intelligence cycle that preceded it. Inside the Nixon administration, however, the raid was not viewed solely through the lens of rescue success or failure. President Richard Nixon and Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird had authorized the mission under wartime authority. From their perspective, the operation demonstrated American resolve and capability. It showed Hanoi and the world that the United States was willing to risk deep penetration operations to recover its prisoners. Legally, the raid violated North Vietnamese sovereignty. But by late 1970, the United States was already engaged in active conflict with North Vietnam. The incursion was framed as a military necessity aimed at rescuing POWs, an objective widely considered legitimate under the laws of armed conflict. The ethical foundation of the mission rested on the principle of recovering captured service members. That moral argument resonated strongly with the American public. Media reaction was swift. Major outlets, including the New York Times, confirmed that the raid had occurred and that no POWs had been found. Although critics questioned the intelligence oversight, much of the public response was supportive. The boldness of the attempt and the absence of American casualties softened criticism. In an era of rising anti-war sentiment, the raid offered a rare narrative of competence and daring. The most significant impact, however, unfolded inside North Vietnam's prison system. In response to the raid, North Vietnamese authorities consolidated American prisoners into larger camps near Hanoi, including Hoa Lo. Previously, POWs had been dispersed across smaller remote facilities. The consolidation, motivated by fear of additional rescue attempts, arguably improved living conditions and communication among prisoners. Former POWs later credited the raid with boosting morale. The knowledge that American forces had attempted a rescue reinforced their belief that they had not been forgotten. Strategically, Sante also influenced future special operations doctrine. The coordination between services, Army Special Forces on the ground, Air Force aviation assets, Navy strike aircraft, and CIA intelligence represented a model of joint task force execution. Real-time command and control, synchronized airstrikes, and rapid extraction procedures were studied extensively in after-action reports. Lessons from Sante would later inform planning for other high-risk rescue missions, including Operation Eagle Claw in 1980. Within the Special Forces community, the raid became legendary. It demonstrated that small elite teams could operate deep inside heavily defended enemy territory with precision. The zero-fatality outcome reinforced the value of meticulous rehearsal and disciplined execution. Many of the officers and NCOs involved went on to shape the development of modern U.S. Special Operations Forces. Yet, the controversy over intelligence lingered. Declassified documents and memoirs highlighted discrepancies between available imagery and the final assessment accepted by planners. Some analysts argued that warning signs had existed but were not integrated properly. Others contended that the fog of war and incomplete data made such errors inevitable. Intelligence work in 1970 lacked the real-time satellite capabilities that later decades would bring. Analysts depended on periodic reconnaissance flights, human sources, and interpretation of grainy imagery. In retrospect, Sante occupies a unique place in military history. It was tactically successful, but strategically ambiguous. No prisoners were freed, yet the raid arguably strengthened American leverage in ongoing peace negotiations and highlighted the POW issue on the international stage. It demonstrated resolve without escalating into broader confrontation with Soviet or Chinese patrons of North Vietnam. For the 56 Green Berets who stormed the compound that night, the mission was defined by discipline and professionalism. They had executed a near-flawless assault under extreme risk. They had proven that the United States could project force into the heart of enemy territory and withdraw intact. Their training, rehearsals at Takli, and adherence to the plan had delivered exactly what they were tasked to do. The emptiness of the prison cells did not diminish that fact. In the years that followed, Sante became a case study taught in military academies and special operations courses. It illustrated the power of joint planning, the necessity of reliable intelligence, and the moral complexity of high-risk rescue missions. It also underscored a hard truth. Even the most precise operation can be undone by a single variable beyond the control of those who carry it out. The Sante raid did not bring anyone home, but it changed the psychological landscape of the war. It reassured prisoners that rescue was possible. It reminded adversaries that distance offered no sanctuary. And it etched into Special Forces history a defining example of courage executed with precision, a mission that succeeded in everything except its primary objective. In that paradox lies its enduring legacy. Fast roping teams, jungle warfare, deep recon, silent raids, the MACV-SOG, the Black Ops unit that wasn't supposed to exist. In the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia during the height of the Vietnam War, A secret war unfolded that few knew existed at the time. It was a shadow campaign fought by an elite cadre of Americans and indigenous allies under the command of MACV-SOG Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. Formed in 1964, MACV-SOG was born from the urgent need to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines, gather actionable intelligence, and conduct cross-border missions that conventional units could not legally or politically touch. What made SOG unique wasn't just the danger of its missions, it was the level of deniability, the techniques they employed, and how far they were willing to go behind enemy lines. At its peak, SOG was executing deep penetration recon, strategic sabotage, prisoner snatches, wiretap installations, and psychological operations, all in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam, places they weren't even supposed to be. And they did so with an audacity and stealth that redefined covert warfare. The SOG operator was a different breed. Each recon team, known by code names like RT Idaho, RT Colorado, or RT New York, was composed of 2 to 3 American Green Berets and 4 to 8 indigenous fighters, often Montagnards, Nungs, or other highly trained local tribesmen. These men would be inserted by helicopters into the densest parts of enemy territory, sometimes just a kilometer or two from known NVA base camps. The jungle was thick, humid, and alive with movement. The NVA weren't just present, they dominated the region. MACV-SOG's job was to slip past their eyes, conduct the mission, and escape without a trace. Mission planning was obsessively detailed. Every operation began with an intel brief that often relied on aerial photos, intercepted comms, and debriefs from prior missions. The recon teams then built custom loadouts. Every bullet, ration, and radio was weighed against speed, noise, and weight. Black fatigues were standard. Face paint and camo netting were applied to blend into the thick canopy. Weapons varied, but suppressed CAR-15, Swedish Ks, sawed-off shotguns, and even captured AKs were common. Everything had to be small, lethal, and fast. Insertion was usually by King B helicopters, operated by South Vietnamese pilots. These choppers would skim treetop level, often drawing fire during ingress. Teams would rope in or jump into LZs no larger than a car. The goal was silence and speed. Once on the ground, they went dark. Radios remained silent except for scheduled comms checks. Movement was slow, methodical. The jungle was their enemy too. Leeches, heat stroke, and jungle rot were constant threats. But the greatest danger came from detection. The moment a recon team was spotted, they were hunted. NVA counter-recon units were specifically trained to track and kill SOG teams. The moment a trail was broken or a team left behind evidence, a cigarette butt, a snapped twig, they were marked. SOG teams often found themselves running from battalion-size elements, dodging sweep lines, doubling back, and calling for extraction while under fire. One famous tactic was the cloverleaf movement. Teams would recon outward in a spiral or clover shape, always returning to their insertion point to avoid ambush. Perhaps the most high-risk missions were wiretap and prisoner snatch operations. In one operation, a SOG team inserted just outside an NVA communication hub, crawled through minefields, and installed a telephone tap. The device relayed top-level enemy comms for weeks before it was discovered. In another, an all-American team disguised as NVA infiltrated a POW camp compound. They were only yards from sleeping guards, but managed to extract a North Vietnamese officer for interrogation. These weren't just raids, they were feats of espionage wrapped in firepower. To support these missions, SOG developed cutting-edge Black Ops tactics. They pioneered the use of false trails, dragging sandbags behind them to simulate different numbers of people, or to throw off trackers. They dropped enemy ammo caches filled with sabotaged rounds that would explode in NVA rifles. They used psychological warfare, including faked NVA broadcasts and ghost radio signals, to confuse and demoralize enemy units. Some of their deception campaigns, like Operation Eldest Son, sowed distrust between NVA troops and their own equipment. SOG also mastered escape and evasion. Each man carried an emergency extraction beacon, often buried in the jungle before insertion and activated if the team had to split. Air assets, including Air Force Covey-FX and fast movers, were always on standby. A team in contact could call for a prairie fire emergency, triggering a massive extraction effort. Gunships, A-1 Sky Raiders, and fighter jets would swarm the area, laying down covering fire as choppers swooped in to extract teams under fire. Entire battles were fought to pull out a single six-man team. And still, many didn't make it. The casualty rate among SOG recon teams was astronomical. Some teams were overrun. Others were never heard from again, but they kept going back, often knowing full well that each mission might be their last. Their operational secrecy was so tight that even other units in Vietnam didn't know what SOG did. They wore no unit insignia. Their missions were scrubbed from logs. Many operators' families didn't know the full extent of their service until decades later. What MACV-SOG accomplished in those early years laid the groundwork for everything that came after. The techniques they developed, deep recon, black insertions, deniable missions, and psychological operations, would directly inform the TTPS, tactics, techniques, procedures, of future Tier 1 units. Delta Force, created in the late 1970s, adopted SOG's debrief cycles, their use of indigenous assets, and their reconnaissance doctrines. Even in today's JSOC operations from Iraq to Syria, you can see the ghost of SOG in every rooftop landing and every silent raid. By late 1966, MACV-SOG mission profile shifted from purely reconnaissance to include aggressive interdiction of the enemy's logistics lifeline, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This jungle highway stretching from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia was the artery pumping troops, weapons, and supplies into South Vietnam. Disrupting it wasn't just a tactical need, it was strategic survival. SOG's mandate evolved into a blunt but invisible tool. Enter the trail zones, destroy everything of value, and vanish before the enemy could catch them. These missions required a new kind of Black Ops warfare stealth laced with sabotage, speed sharpened by sabotage. Small recon teams, often just 6 to 8 men strong, would slip across the border into Laos or Cambodia, where they would spend days shadowing truck convoys, watching trail intersections, and identifying choke points. Their gear was tailored for demolition: claymore mines, Dagger, C4 bricks, grenade launchers, and hand-placed directional charges. Every pound carried had to earn its keep. Most missions aimed to lay traps along trails, ambushes that would either destroy NVA supply units or force them to reroute, buying critical time for American and ARVN forces inside South Vietnam. One of the most dangerous assignments was placing road cratering charges on narrow jungle paths. Operators would dig beneath hard-packed dirt and place buried charges timed with pressure fuses or remote triggers, then pull back to watch. In one such operation near Chapone, a SOG team blew a fuel convoy using a multi-stage ambush. The first blast tore open the road, the second hit the tanker trucks, and the third, a final set of claymores raked the survivors. The jungle exploded in flames. Operators watched through night vision scopes, counting enemy dead and vehicles destroyed. Moments later, they were moving again, knowing reinforcements were already being scrambled to intercept them. Sabotage wasn't always about explosives. In a mission recorded near the Bankari Pass, a recon team inserted at night and crept into an NVA supply station camouflaged inside a small village. While 2 Americans overwatched from the tree line, Montagnard team members snuck in and contaminated rice sacks with powdered laxatives and spoiled meat extract. The goal was to cripple entire platoons with illness. The team slipped away unnoticed, but SIGINT reported a sharp drop in radio traffic from the unit days later. They had succeeded without firing a shot. Communication disruption was another specialty. SOGG teams used field wiretaps and demolition to great effect. In one mission, a team led by a seasoned 1-0 tapped into a major comms cable near the Mujia Pass. The cable, buried and armored, was carefully uncovered, spliced, and fitted with a listening device that fed enemy traffic to Covey aircraft above. The intel flowed for nearly 72 hours before NVA engineers discovered the breach and sent patrols to flush out the intruders. The team escaped under fire, zigzagging through gullies and karst formations while calling for extraction. King B helicopters swooped in low as gunships sprayed the ridgelines behind them. MACV-SOG developed innovative sabotage techniques specifically for the dense jungle environment. In certain operations, teams used delayed fuses or even battery-powered timers to hit targets hours after exfil. One method involved tying plastic explosives to key bridge supports or culverts, setting a timer, and retreating across the border before the blast. This not only bought distance, but denied the NVA a quick response. On several occasions, enemy engineers returned to find critical bridges or road sections completely destroyed with no trace of who had done it. Ambush missions were arguably the most harrowing. SOGG teams would sometimes spend 24 to 48 hours lying in wait near trail bends or river crossings, camouflaged to the point of invisibility, waiting for NVA units to pass. When the moment came, they would spring the ambush using claymores and machine guns, inflict maximum casualties in seconds, then melt into the jungle. One team recounted an ambush in 1968 where they took down a platoon-sized column, seized maps and documents, and disappeared before enemy QRFs arrived. The documents revealed new infiltration routes and future attacks intel that was passed immediately to field commanders in South Vietnam. These missions demanded total discipline. Noise discipline, light discipline, and route masking were sacred. Teams would never walk on trails. They moved parallel, sometimes through swamps or ridgelines to avoid contact. They booby-trapped their own back trails if they had to bug out. They wanted the enemy to pay for every step. Every team practiced exfiltration drills religiously. If contact was made, the mission flipped instantly into survival mode. Extraction zones were never static. Teams would mark alternate LZs with infrared strobes visible only to Covey aircraft. In several cases, teams had to fight for their LZ, calling in A-1 Sky Raiders and F-4 Phantoms to bomb the jungle, while Slicks came in under fire. One legendary story involved a recon team near Atapu in Laos. The team inserted deep, expecting a 48-hour recon, but discovered a massive logistics node. Instead of simply observing, the 1-0 called in B-52 coordinates, relayed through an airborne FAC. Just before the arc light strike, the team laid directional charges and claymores along the retreat route, knowing that survivors would flee into the jungle. As the bombs rained down, the SOG team ambushed retreating forces, then evaded through a dry creek bed for over 10 kilometers to their secondary LZ. They made it out with film, maps, and bloodied uniforms, but no losses. Many of these stories never made it into public record. MACV-SOG operated in such secrecy that even their awards were often given under false unit designations. Their missions in Laos and Cambodia violated international law, which is why they had no support from conventional ground forces and why their presence was never acknowledged. If captured, they had standing orders to claim they were contractors or lost South Vietnamese troops. SOGG teams carried no ID. Many wore captured enemy gear. Their radios were encoded, their maps were hand-drawn, and their uniforms didn't match. But their effectiveness was undeniable. Between 1967 and 1970, MACV-SOG teams sabotaged hundreds of trail segments, destroyed convoys, intercepted comms, and disrupted the flow of men and weapons into the south. For every trail cratered or bridge destroyed, entire battalions were delayed. For every convoy ambushed or supply depot ruined, a battle in South Vietnam was reshaped, and they did it with fewer than 1,000 operators at any given time. Sabotage wasn't just part of SOG's mission, it was a philosophy. To them, the best kill was one that didn't need a bullet. The most valuable victory was the enemy starving, stranded, or retreating before the fight even began. And with every trail destroyed, every convoy vaporized, and every bridge collapsed under shadowy hands, SOG proved that a war could be fought not just in battles, but in every quiet moment between them. By 1968, MACV-SOG focus turned toward one of its most elusive and dangerous targets, the enemy's brain. Deep within Laos and Cambodia, beyond the reach of conventional firepower, North Vietnamese headquarters elements operated in secrecy, commanding troop movements, orchestrating logistics, and coordinating large-scale offensives into South Vietnam. These hidden command centers were not just buildings. They were networks of bunkers, relay stations, hardened communication points, and protected corridors. Finding them was like chasing smoke through the jungle. Destroying them required an entirely new level of precision and audacity. SOG recon teams were tasked with the nearly impossible: locate, identify, and relay the exact position of these mobile HQs, sometimes within shouting distance of the enemy, and extract without being seen. These missions weren't about enemy body counts or cratering roads. They were about listening, watching, and staying alive long enough to transmit the information. The reward was immense. If a command node could be verified and targeted, it could trigger a B-52 arc light strike or a fast mover package capable of decapitating an entire offensive chain. The jungle along the Mugia and Bon Karai passes became prime hunting grounds. Intel suggested that multiple enemy regimental and division-level headquarters rotated through these areas in hardened underground facilities. SOG teams inserted with the goal of detecting patterns, supply porters making repeated trips, radio traffic spikes, vehicle noises, and guard routines. Teams would lay up for days, camouflaged into the jungle floor, barely moving, watching through optics as enemy officers met under tarps or passed documents. Even the act of counting porters or listening to message runners could be a breakthrough. One recon mission near Mong Nong in 1969 remains infamous. A team of 6 inserted under darkness, dropped 15 kilometers from a suspected NVA regimental HQ. Within hours of landing, they picked up signs, radio antennae strung through trees, fresh trail cuts, and oddly uniformed foot traffic. They set up an LPOP, listening post, observation post, within 300 meters of a small clearing and began logging activity. What they witnessed over the next 36 hours confirmed their worst fears. Senior officers arriving under escort, heavy communications usage, and an array of guards rotating in shifts. The team attempted to call in an airstrike, but were told to confirm visual ID of a regimental commander before release. The 1-0, using a low-light scope, managed to capture images of a distinctive uniform and overheard a conversation referencing planned movements into South Vietnam. This was the break command needed. Within 6 hours, B-52s flattened the area in waves. The team, now compromised by patrolling enemy troops, had to extract under extreme duress. 2 were wounded in the breakout, and they evaded for nearly 24 hours before being lifted by King B exfil, burning the last of their smokes and claymores to keep pursuit at bay. Many missions didn't get that lucky. In areas like Chapone or the A Shau Valley's western ridge, SOG teams found themselves in zones crawling with security units designed to hunt infiltrators. One veteran recalled a mission where, after 4 days of shadowing, a courier believed to be carrying command documents. The team was ambushed by an NVA sweep patrol. They were chased for over 20 kilometers, forced to cross 2 rivers, and abandoned most of their gear. They made it out with only a bloodstained notebook and a memory card. The notebook later revealed coordinates of fallback HQ sites for enemy battalions. What made these missions particularly brutal was the terrain and enemy counterintelligence. Command nodes weren't marked with signs. They were hidden beneath thatched huts, buried in hillsides, or mobile entirely. The jungle worked against recon teams, canopy cover blocked air support, rain and mist rendered optics nearly useless. In some cases, teams resorted to planting seismic sensors or small repeater nodes, devices that could passively track movement or radio emissions even after the team exfiltrated. These black boxes would later feed data back to airborne listeners, creating long-term surveillance networks. In one mission deep inside Cambodia, a SOG team inserted via low-level halo drop, gliding into a suspected HQ zone where multiple NVA units had recently vanished from U.S. radar. The team split into 2 elements. One set up a decoy trail to draw security patrols, while the other crawled into an abandoned hut where they found fragments of documents and half-burned field maps. They called in a Covey FAC to verify potential strike zones, but the jungle made targeting impossible. Instead, the team planted time delay charges and motion sensors, then exfiltrated at dawn using a pre-positioned canoe hidden in the reeds. Days later, sensor alerts confirmed renewed activity. The area was later hit with a multi-platform airstrike. No bodies were recovered, but SIGINT confirmed loss of radio contact with 2 enemy battalions. Every successful recon mission brought a temporary advantage. Each failed mission carried immense cost. Entire teams were sometimes wiped out, caught in ambushes after their positions were compromised by trackers or dogs. Some operators were captured and disappeared. Others had to be extracted under withering fire, leaving behind fallen teammates. But they kept going. The mission demanded it. Without their eyes and ears, command had no ability to target the hidden architecture of the enemy. To support these high-risk missions, MACV-SOG developed advanced camouflage kits, deceptive trail techniques, and drone-like bird call transmitters. Operators trained to identify subtle terrain features, crushed grass indicating repeated movement, condensation trails on brush revealing hidden storage, or unnatural silence pointing to enemy presence. Some teams planted false footprints in different directions to mislead NVA scouts. They used broken mirror flashes to redirect aircraft without radios. One team even lured a patrol away by triggering their own tripwire traps and doubling back along a stream bed. When a team confirmed a headquarters location, the clock started ticking. Every hour increased the chance of detection or compromise. Fast movers were often scrambled from Thailand or Da Nang, and timing had to be perfect. The operator on the ground would lace the target using early IR pointers or mark it with smoke, sometimes getting within 100 meters of enemy command tents to ensure accuracy. During one raid, a team coordinated 3 strike waves, watching as enemy command structures were obliterated while they lay hidden less than 500 meters away, documenting blast effects through lens filters. These were surgical missions with no margin for error. They weren't raids, they weren't ambushes. They were the spear point of strategic intelligence gathering in an era with no satellites, no real-time drone feeds, and no GPS. Every click was measured by instinct and practiced silence. Every face in the jungle could be the last they ever saw. And yet they moved patiently, dangerously, always forward. In Part 4, we'll follow MACV-SOG into one of the war's most psychologically taxing arenas: prisoner snatches, body recovery missions, and intelligence extractions, the rarest and most politically volatile operations of the secret war. There were missions so rare, so delicate, and so politically volatile that only the most trusted and experienced MACV-SOG teams were ever assigned to them. These were not missions of sabotage or reconnaissance. These were prisoner snatches, body recovery missions, and intelligence extractions operations that required equal parts ruthlessness and restraint, and where the cost of failure could extend beyond the battlefield and into international headlines. They were as close as a soldier in Vietnam could come to espionage without wearing a suit. By 1969, intelligence coming out of Laos and Cambodia painted a chilling picture. Key enemy figures were operating just beyond the border, organizing offensives, managing supply chains, and coordinating with external advisors. These were not frontline commanders, but the brains of the enemy war effort. Capturing one alive, interrogating him, or recovering documentation from his person could yield intelligence worth more than a dozen successful raids. SOG teams began targeting these individuals in highly classified operations that often had to be carried out without any trace or acknowledgement. One such mission began with aerial surveillance and SIGINT intercepts, suggesting that a mid-level NVA intelligence officer was frequenting a relay post near Ban Bak, just inside Laos. The officer traveled with a small entourage, usually 3 or 4 bodyguards, and changed his route often. A 6-man recon team was tasked not with observing him but capturing him. They inserted under darkness, moved into an ambush position, and waited for over 30 hours in heavy rain. When the target finally appeared, the team triggered a non-lethal claymore, stunning the group. In the ensuing chaos, they subdued the officer using blunt trauma and zip cuffs. His guards were either killed or fled. The team exfiltrated with the unconscious officer on a makeshift stretcher, pursued by a reaction force. The intelligence recovered from his debrief directly led to the exposure of a fuel depot 10 kilometers south, which was later destroyed in a coordinated airstrike. Body recovery missions were even more emotionally charged. These weren't just about strategy, they were about bringing home fellow operators who had disappeared into the jungle. When a team was presumed killed but left no confirmed KIA or recovery, SOG would often mount a retrieval mission, either to recover remains or confirm status. These were deeply personal, high-risk operations with zero margin for error. In one of the most haunting examples, a team inserted into the area where RT Nevada had disappeared 2 weeks earlier. The terrain was mountainous, heavily patrolled, and choked with elephant grass. The team used drone-like bird call devices to mask their movement and moved only at dusk or dawn. After 3 days of slow movement, they located a half-buried rucksack and shredded uniform fragments. Near a dry creek bed, they found 2 shallow graves. Using entrenching tools, they recovered partial remains, tags, and a personal item: a silver Zippo with the engraved initials of the 10. They marked the site for aerial pickup and extracted under the cover of pre-planned artillery suppression. The bodies were later identified and returned to their families, an act that became sacred within the SOG community. The psychological toll of these missions was immense. Capturing someone alive in enemy territory meant keeping them silent, secured, and hidden, while simultaneously preparing for extraction. Teams trained in advanced restraint techniques, sedation protocols, and how to move prisoners silently over rough terrain. Some missions involved knocking out targets with blunt strikes or injected sedatives, then binding them in camouflage stretchers that blended into the jungle floor. During one such mission, a prisoner awoke during exfil and began screaming in Vietnamese. The team had to knock him unconscious again with a rifle butt to avoid detection. Minutes later, enemy search teams passed within 50 meters of their hiding position. Interrogations, when they occurred, were conducted at forward operating bases, with interpreters and intelligence officers standing by. SOG operators rarely handled the questioning themselves, but the preparation and extraction were their responsibility. The intelligence gained from these prisoners often included infiltration routes, planned attacks, unit strength estimates, and methods of supply distribution. In several instances, it led directly to successful airstrikes or interdictions that saved hundreds of lives downrange. MACV-SOG also carried out psychological warfare operations as an extension of their intelligence efforts. They planted forged documents, dropped altered propaganda, and spread rumors among captured enemies to seed distrust. In one unique operation, a captured courier was fed false information and then released near an NVA patrol route with a planted map. Days later, that map led enemy units into an ambush that destroyed a supply convoy. Some of the rarest missions involved snatching suspected foreign advisors. These missions were almost never acknowledged, even internally. Rumors swirled of encounters with Soviet or Chinese personnel advising NVA logistics groups or managing communications hubs in Cambodia. In one heavily redacted mission, a SOG team reportedly recovered documents written in Cyrillic and a radio log indicating Russian language traffic in the area. The team exfiltrated under heavy pursuit, and while no advisor was captured, the documentation led to increased surveillance and the deployment of strategic reconnaissance assets over the region. Failure in these missions wasn't just operational, it was political. If a prisoner died in custody or a mission was exposed publicly, it could cause international fallout. That's why such operations required multiple layers of deniability. Operators wore no identifying insignia. Some missions used weapons commonly carried by the enemy to avoid obvious American fingerprints. Radios used coded brevity scripts, and any visual intel was processed only at compartmentalized levels. In some cases, captured prisoners were moved through multiple fobs before being handed over to ARVN units for final processing to maintain plausible deniability. The emotional aftermath lingered long after the extraction. Operators often reported difficulty sleeping, recurring dreams, and flashbacks. Many refused to speak about these missions for decades. Capturing a man alive in a jungle war zone, evading an enemy force while dragging his struggling body, or digging up the remains of a fallen teammate. These were memories that dug deeper than shrapnel. But they did it, again and again, not for medals, not for glory. Most of the time, their actions were never recorded in any official capacity. These were the missions that history books skipped, the ones that intelligence agencies quietly praised behind closed doors, and they were often the difference between a blind war and one guided by real, hard-won human intelligence. In Part 5, we'll examine the final phase of MACV-SOG's Vietnam operations, how they shifted into interdicting cross-border movements at scale, working with indigenous proxy forces, and laying the groundwork for the transition to post-war special operations doctrine. By 1970, the nature of MACV-SOG's war had changed. The secret war in Laos and Cambodia was no longer a purely surgical game of reconnaissance and sabotage. As U.S. strategy shifted toward Vietnamization, the pressure on SOG to interdict enemy movement at scale intensified. The North Vietnamese were pouring troops and supplies across the border in preparation for what would become their final offensives. MACV-SOG teams had to adapt fast, pivoting from precision raids to sustained border interdiction, broader coordination with indigenous proxy forces, and legacy-focused training missions. These were the twilight years of the secret war, gritty, aggressive, and deeply influential on future special operations doctrine. In early 1970, SOG launched Operation Salem House, a multi-pronged effort to sever major arteries along the Ho Chi Minh Trail using continuous recon, large-scale ambushes, and layered intelligence. The missions became more dangerous, more frequent, and often involved overlapping recon zones with multiple teams operating simultaneously. The terrain was unforgiving triple canopy jungle, cloud-choked valleys, and NVA units now heavily reinforced with armor, anti-air assets, and hardened defensive tactics. To meet the demand, SOG expanded its reliance on indigenous proxy forces. Montagnard tribesmen, Cambodian Khmer Serae, and Laotian irregulars trained under CIA programs were integrated into operations. In many cases, these fighters provided critical local knowledge, language skills, and endurance unmatched by conventional troops. SOG teams began embedding more deeply with these units, forming composite strike teams capable of operating for weeks at a time in enemy-controlled areas. These partnerships created a multiplier effect, so GWAS no longer just six-man recon teams. It was a hidden force, with an entire shadow army. One mission near the Laotian border involved a composite team of 2 Green Berets and 12 Khmer Sere fighters who identified and then ambushed a column of NVA porters moving mortar rounds toward the Aisho Valley. After a 3-day stalk, they hit the convoy using synchronized claymore charges and small arms fire, killing or dispersing the enemy. Captured maps showed multiple supply points further north. Instead of exfiltrating, the team pushed deeper, calling in gunships to strike a hidden cache and marking future targets for drone-like sensor pods. The use of technology increased in these final years. SOG began deploying long-range seismic sensors, miniaturized relays, and acoustic monitors to triangulate movement along the trail. These tools allowed recon teams to spend less time exposed and more time planning strikes. One operation in late 1971 saw a team drop a string of sensors along a tributary road near Chipone. Within hours, movement data was relayed to a nearby fire base, triggering a coordinated airstrike that destroyed an NVA fuel convoy. The SOG team watched from a hilltop nearly a mile away as fireballs lit the night sky. But even with tech and proxies, the danger never abated. Enemy counter-recon tactics evolved rapidly. Tracker teams now included dogs. NVA troops began sweeping in wider arcs using noise discipline and better map intelligence. In some cases, they deployed their own version of SOG specially trained hunters designed to sniff out American teams. In response, SOG doubled down on deception. Teams planted dummy trails, used noise generators to lure pursuers, and relied more heavily on multiple fallback LZs. By mid-1972, as American involvement in Vietnam began to wind down, SOG teams took on more training and capacity-building missions. In Cambodia, they helped organize indigenous strike companies, units trained in sabotage, ambush, and intelligence gathering. These groups conducted missions independent of American oversight, using tactics learned directly from SOG. In South Vietnam, Green Berets worked alongside ARVN Rangers and SF units to refine fast rope insertions, battlefield comms, and silent extraction drills. One mission involved training a Montagnard platoon in long-range recon skills. Weeks later, that same unit led a deep penetration mission into Laos that uncovered a new logistics hub and directed artillery strikes that crippled NVA staging efforts. In this way, SOG ensured that even as their direct footprint shrank, their operational effect continued. Some of the last SOG missions were not about killing or gathering intel, but about preparing for collapse. Teams developed contingency plans for American personnel extraction, burned classified caches, and planted scorched earth protocols in key FOBs. There were training cycles devoted solely to what would happen if U.S. presence vanished overnight. Many SOG veterans remember those final years as marked by a strange duality. They were still fighting, but also burying their own legacy. A few operations stood out in these closing chapters. One team inserted deep in Cambodia near a suspected enemy rally point. They discovered a mix of NVA and Khmer Rouge elements setting up a training camp. The team relayed intel back to command, triggering a coordinated ARVN and Cambodian strike. The aftermath revealed training manuals, weapons caches, and rosters listing hundreds of fighters. The mission had disrupted a potential staging ground for a future regional insurgency. Another operation in late 1972 saw SOG teams aiding in the defense of a CIA-affiliated hilltop station under siege by NVA forces. While officially off mission, the team volunteered to support, directing air support, providing sniper overwatch, and helping coordinate a last-minute exfil for American advisors. It was one of the last direct action engagements fought by SOG operators before formal drawdown orders arrived. Throughout this final phase, SOG's actions reflected a shift in mindset from high-risk individual raids to shaping long-term battlefield dynamics. They weren't just fighting the enemy anymore, they were trying to leave behind a self-sustaining network of resistance, or intelligence gathering and sabotage. The lessons learned during these years would become gospel for later units like Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, and JSOC task forces. Every tactic, every claymore trap, every silent LZ, every exfil under fire was studied and refined. SOG operators who later served in Delta or taught at Special Forces schools embedded these doctrines into the DNA of American Special Operations. Fast insertion, precision sabotage, deep partnerships with local forces, intelligence-driven action, absolute deniability, These were not just practices, they were gospel. As the sun set on MACV-SOG's combat role, their shadow still moved across future battlefields. They had proven what was possible, that a small group of highly trained men using unconventional tactics could punch holes in enemy strategy, disrupt entire campaigns, and leave without a trace. And though the war itself was lost, the methods they pioneered would live on. When MACV-SOG was disbanded in 1972, its legacy didn't fade. It went underground, embedded in the DNA of America's future warriors. Though the unit had operated in total secrecy, the lessons learned in its brutal, silent war echoed through every Tier 1 operation that followed. SOG didn't just influence modern special operations, it built the prototype. From the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq, the playbook of elite warfare was written in the blood, sweat, and silence of SOG recon teams. When Delta Force was founded in 1977, its architects looked directly at SOG for guidance. Charlie Beckwith, Delta's founder, had served with MACV-SOG during the height of the Vietnam War. He brought back more than just stories. He brought doctrine, how to build deniable units, how to conduct deep recon without support, how to run black operations under political constraints, and how to trust 6 men to change the course of a theater. Delta's initial training program included modules modeled on SOG's insertion methods, jungle movement, covert comms, and target identification techniques. More than tactics, it was mindset that carried forward. SOG operators had learned to operate in complete autonomy. No QRF, no backup, no extraction if things went sideways. That principle shaped the early years of Delta, and later, GSOC. Missions in Panama, Somalia, and Bosnia followed the same rhythm. Eyes on recon, small team direct action, rapid exfil. When Delta cleared the way for Rangers during Operation Just Cause, they did so using techniques born in the Laotian jungle night insertion, rapid breach, targeted snatch, and instant withdrawal. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the fingerprints of SOG were everywhere. When Task Force 121 hunted high-value targets in Baghdad, they used blacked-out helicopters, ISR feeds, and human intel networks just like SOG had, with the same doctrine of own the night. Operators flooded buildings under NVGs, snatched suspects before they knew they'd been targeted, and exfiltrated within minutes. When JSOC built fusion cells in Balad and Bagram, they replicated SOG's habit of embedding intelligence analysts directly into operational planning, shortening the loop from recon to action. Even in gear and loadout, SOG's influence was visible. The modular packs, suppressed weapons, handheld radios, and short-barreled carbines carried by Tier 1 units in modern war zones evolved from the field modifications SOG teams made on their own in Vietnam. The rule had always been, if it doesn't help in contact, it doesn't come. That same ethos guided the gear rooms of Delta and DevGru, but it was the mentality, the deep, quiet aggression that stuck the longest. SOG operators had learned that success meant becoming ghosts, invisible, precise, brutal when necessary, and always several moves ahead. That became gospel for the men who hunted Zarqawi, who landed on Pakistani soil to kill bin Laden, who ran capture-kill operations in Syria. The tempo, the silence, the constant pivoting from recon to assault, those were SOG principles. Some of the most effective operations in the post-9/11 era directly mirrored SOG missions. During the surge in Iraq, Delta Force built intelligence webs in Mosul and Baghdad by capturing low-level facilitators and working up the ladder exactly as SOG had done with couriers on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Operators learned local languages, developed informants, and staged for weeks at safe houses before executing a strike. One former Delta operator said it plainly: "Every time we crossed into Syria or did a hit inside our city, we were living in SOG's shadow." Psychological operations also bore SOG's signature. SOG had forged documents, planted false intel, and used captured prisoners to seed misinformation techniques that modern units would later refine into full-spectrum information warfare. In Afghanistan, false raids were conducted just to make insurgents shift safe houses. In Iraq, fake IDs and forged cell phones were used to create phantom networks that drew enemy resources away from real operations. MACV-SOG also pioneered the concept of joint indigenous warfare, working hand-in-hand with local forces to build long-term capability. The Montagnard teams of SOG became the blueprint for today's partner force programs. Whether it was training Kurdish CTG units in Iraq or shepherding Afghan commandos, Modern operators echoed the old SOG model. Train hard, fight beside them, earn their loyalty, and make them lethal. Legacy also came in the form of ethos. The SOG motto, silent, deadly professional, was never printed on banners, but it lived in every operator's kit. The respect for secrecy, the discipline under fire, the commitment to the mission, even at personal cost, these were values passed from generation to generation in whispered stories and scars and quiet nods during training. Some of the original SOG veterans would go on to teach at Bragg, Fort Lewis, or Dam Neck, shaping new classes without ever revealing what they'd done. But the method stuck. The rise of hybrid war and gray zone conflict only proved how far ahead SOG had been. Their missions had always occupied the space between war and peace, politics and combat. Today's special operations environment, where actions must be deniable, precise, and globally mobile, is a world SOG prepared America for. When operators infiltrate a foreign country to sabotage infrastructure or grab a financier, they follow a trail cut decades earlier through the jungle. Even the resurgence of small team warfare in the 2020s echoes SOG. The shift away from heavy footprints and big unit tactics has returned elite units to their roots. 6 to 8 man cells, long-range recon, surgical strikes, and close coordination with interagency and intelligence services. The modular kill chain that modern forces use sensors, shooters, analysts, cyber warfare is nothing more than an evolved version of what SOG did with map, radio, and gut instinct. And perhaps most of all, SOG left behind a culture of silence. No glory, no parade, just the mission. For years, their operations were buried in vaults, their names missing from rolls, their awards delivered under false units,